Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 1. The sun of dawn shined down bright onto the water gardens. The pools and fountains were turned to liquid gold by the light. Elia Martell stood on the balcony and watched as a few children splashed in one of the fountains while a few others were standing atop each other's shoulders in one of the pools, one pair trying to push the other over and into the cool water of the pool. She spied Ariane and Quentin sitting in the shade of one of the blood-orange trees, under the care of their Septa, who was reading from her holy book. Tyann was sitting in the lap of her own Septa while her sisters were fighting in one other of the other pools. Obera was the stronger and bigger of the two, but Nymeria was quicker and she avoided every attempt her older sister made to grab her. Watching the children at their play never failed to bring her joy, but now the joy was tinged with sadness. She had always believed that her own children would one day play with her brothers in the pools, but now that, which had seemed so certain not so very long ago, now seemed like something that was an impossibility. It had been only a few short weeks that the news had come to dawn on the wings of a raven. Oberyn had lost his mind. He had screamed and raged and rode along the coast and deep into the sands and up into the mountains and demanded that the spears be raised in rebellion, for all Dorne to scream and let the king in the Red Keep hear them, hear all their rage. Doran had to send an entire force of guards as well as Aerohotter to bring their little brother back before he actually dragged them into a war. Oberyn had not been happy when he had been brought back last night. The ringing of that argument still blared in her eyes and her entire body was filled with a bone-deep tiredness, and all Elia wanted to do was crawl in her bed and sleep, and in truth she didn't care that much if she would ever wake up again. She was just so tired of everything at the moment. The sound of her door opening almost went unnoticed as Elia continued to gaze down into the gardens and only looked up when she heard her name being called. A maidservant was standing in the doorway, her dark eyes shining with pity like every man and woman in the gardens for her, like all the men and women of Sunspear, like all the men and women of Dawn. Poor, gentle, delicate Elia, who had been so cruelly set aside. She hated it more than anything. Elia wanted to scream and pull at her hair and tear her room to shambles, but she knew that she would not. Her mother has raised a gentle noblewoman, despite some small training with a sword that her brother had insisted on. She would endure the insult, and the pity, with as much dignity as only a princess could do. "Princess, forgive me for intruding, but Prince Doran would like for you to attend him." The maid spoke quietly and slowly, almost as if she believed that one word, said in the wrong way, might cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Elia offered her a gentle smile and nodded as she made her way out of the room. Elia walked through the halls of the water gardens. Everywhere she turned there were shrieks of joy from children who were playing a dozen different games and won. It was like knives being dragged through her heart. As she walked deeper through the palace, towards her elder brother's Solar, the shrieks of joy were soon replaced by screams of rage and rants that threatened to turn into tantrums. Aerohotter was standing outside the door, guarding her elder brother as ever. If it had been anyone else inside the Solar with Doran, then the large man would be in there as well, but Aero knew as well as Elia did that Oberyn would never hurt Doran, no matter how angry he ever got. The captain of the guards bent his head in greeting and pulled his long axe out of the way, and Elia opened the door to step inside. Doran was sitting behind his desk, rubbing at his nose while Oberyn was pacing left and right. A storm trapped in the body of a man, a viper ready to strike at anyone who made a wrong step. When they heard the door open, Oberyn looked up with a glare in his eyes, but the moment that he saw that it was her, his gaze softened, but only for a moment before he rounded back onto Doran. "Tell her. Tell her what it is you mean to do." Doran looked annoyed for a moment before he turned his attention to her. "Elia, no one is more sorry than I for what happened to your engagement to Prince Rhaegar. I know how fond you were of him, and the loss of the opportunity to become queen is a great loss, and I more than understand if you need more time. Alas, as a princess of Dawn you do have a duty. He wants you to marry a northerner, as far north as north goes without going beyond the wall itself." Oberyn jumped in once again, resuming his restless pacing. "He wants you to wed the Stark boy." "Brandon?" Elia asked with a frown. She had seen the eldest Stark son at 1 or 2 feasts, and he was certainly handsome. He also seemed to be unbearably arrogant and irritating, and Elia could not see herself being happy with him. Alas, if that was only the biggest problem. "Brandon Stark is betrothed to Catelyn Tully. Did Lord Tully break the engagement?" "Oh no, sweet sister. He doesn't want to wed you to the heir, no. He wants to wed you to the spare." Eddard. It shamed her to think that it took her a moment to try and think of who her brother meant. It came to her soon enough. There had always been a solemn boy near Brandon at those feasts, not as handsome but with enough similarity in features that there was clearly a relation. Thank you, Oberyn, as it stands it's not as though we have much choice. The king has broken the engagement. Lord Tywine refused betrothing either of his children to either of you. Lord Arryn has no sons and his heir is betrothed, I believe. Lord Tully's son is too young. I am not sending Elia to the Iron Islands and the Tyrells wouldn't have us. The Starks are our only option and Lord Rickard is receptive to the idea. Yes, he gets a princess and Elia gets a spare, children who will inherit nothing except perhaps being guardsmen in their uncle's armies and perhaps a little stone keep, if they are lucky. Oberyn was starting to slow his pacing, but Elia, who was used to her little brother's moods, could tell that he was still angry. Why does it have to be a great house, why not a Dornish house? Because wedding Elia to a Dornish house gets us nothing, the other house would be the only one to benefit from it. Euronwood would be the obvious exception but I am unlikely to consider that. Oberyn scoffed and Doran's eyes narrowed. House Hightower could be another option, though given the insult you gave Baelor Hightower I would expect that avenue has been closed to us as well. If Breakwind is truly so sensitive. Oberyn, I warn you I am short of patience. May I speak? Nothing in Elia's voice gave the indication that it was a request. Her brothers fell silent and she began to speak. I am hurt that I have been put aside, I see no point in denying that. And I have never forgotten my duty, Doran I assure you. And, from what I know of him Oberyn, Eddard Stark seems an honorable enough man to me. I would consent to marrying him. Write to Lord Rickard. Doran looked pleased but Oberyn did not, he didn't look angry. Elia didn't think that she had ever seen her little brother angry at her. What was in his dark eyes now, was nothing short of worry. The north is cold in summer, Elia. It's winter now. You aren't well. Obj, I am as unwell in the height of summer as I am in the depths of winter. I am simply an unwell woman, perhaps a change would be as good as a rest. Don't you think? She asked gently and Oberyn simply stared at her like he had no idea who she was. Elia sighed and turned to her elder brother. Doran, I am quite tired. With your leave, I believe I shall retire. Once she had seen Doran nod, Elia turned and made her way out of the solar. She had only taken 3 steps before she heard the sounds of the argument resuming. She didn't stop to listen, she simply kept walking with her head held high until she reached her chamber. She crawled onto her bed, curled herself into a ball, and wept. End of Chapter 1. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 2. Eddard Stark had never wished that he had been only a child in his entire life. He loved his siblings a great deal. Brandon was brave and strong and good-hearted, Lyanna was strong-headed and knew no fear and Benjen was a sweet and playful lad who loved his older siblings with all his heart who bore no one any ill will. But at the moment he was wishing he was at least 2 siblings short. He was sitting on a small chair in Brandon's bedchamber listening as his older brother and sister were once again complaining about their betrothals to Catelyn Tully and Robert Baratheon respectively. He understood, he truly did. He had been just recently informed that he was to be betrothed to Elia Martell, Princess of Dorne. It wasn't that he didn't understand his siblings' feelings. It was just that at this particular moment in time he did not care and did not want to hear their complaining, but it seemed that at this moment in time he could do nothing but bite his tongue and wait for them both to finish complaining. It's completely unfair. I've never even met Robert Baratheon before and now I am expected to marry him. Lyanna shouted as she paced up and down the room. How could father want me to marry a man like him? He already has a bastard daughter, that girl in the Vale. How could you want me to marry him, Ned, if you already knew that? Ned had to bite his lip at that. It was true that Robert did have a base-born girl in the Vale, put on one of the serving women of the Gates of the Moon. She was a jolly little thing, to be sure. Little Milestone and Robert was extremely fond of her. Oft he would ride down the mountain to go and visit her and often Ned would go with him to watch as his friend tossed the little girl up into the air, never failing to catch her, his laughter louder than the squeals of her joy. He understood why Lyanna was upset, of course. Knowing a man that you had been betrothed to had already forsaken your bed could not be a happy thought to deal with, but at the same time there was nothing for her to be concerned with. Many unmarried lords had bastards before they wed and Robert did not stop talking about how much he was looking forward to the wedding. He did not doubt that Robert would keep to her bed in the end. But Lyanna at least had solid enough reason to complain, unlike Brandon. Brandon was going to marry Catelyn Tully, a woman widely believed to be one of the most beautiful women alive, and Catelyn had visited Winterfell in the past few moons as she had struck Ned as a lady of grace, wit and intelligence that more than matched her beauty, so therefore Brandon should have no reason to complain. But complain he did. And unlike Lyanna, he didn't even have a good reason. He did have a reason, but it wasn't a good one, and as much as he hated to admit it, it was a reason that made Ned ashamed to be Brandon's brother. Brandon was the wild wolf of Winterfell, and he was led by his passions and had little restraint, thus he slept with every serving wench and servant girl who would let him lay with them. Brandon had been very lucky that so far no woman had turned up at the gates of the castle with a newborn babe in her arms. He had to wonder what father would do if one did. Thus he didn't want to marry Catelyn because he didn't want to be tied to women, so he could continue to lay with as many women as he chose to, and it disappointed Ned a great deal. He had always defended his older brother to his father, saying that soon Brandon would grow out of it. So far he had yet to grow out of it. At least Brandon didn't complain quite as much as Lyanna did, but that wasn't saying much at all. At the moment their brother was sitting on his bed nodding along with everything Lyanna was saying, agreeing with every word she was saying against Robert, despite the fact he wasn't much better and in some ways was far, far worse. Lyanna sighed and sat down next to her eldest brother. "I can't believe father is being so unfair," she moaned. "He isn't being unfair, Lyanna," Ned said with a loud sigh. "We all have to get married eventually, none of us have any real choice in the matter." He supposed that technically speaking he and his brothers had a little more choice. They could go to the wall, but there was no chance in all seven hells that Brandon would even consider going celibate. Benjen was a sweet boy not built for it, and he would rather get married than freeze to death there despite it being an honorable cause. "Why are you still defending him, Ned?" Brandon said with a disbelieving look on his face. "You're being forced to marry someone who you've never even met aside from seeing her across from halls during feasts." "Yes, I am," Ned yelled as he jumped out of his chair, knocking it to the floor. His siblings looked up at him in shock, and he understood why. He was quiet and somber Ned who never raised his voice and made his disapproval known by how quiet and withdrawn he was. But he had reached the end of his patience, and his siblings had forgotten that he was a wolf as well. "Lyanna, you have 2 more years before you have to marry Robert. You aren't even betrothed, you are engaged to be betrothed. Brandon, you have another year before you are to marry Catelyn. I am marrying Elia as soon as she arrives. Father has sent over the invitations, so could the 2 of you please stop your whining, because I do not want to hear any more of it," he shouted at the top of his voice. His siblings stared at him open-mouthed before Ned spun on his feet and stormed out of the room with a grim expression on his face. He was going to the Godswood, he needed to pray. End of Chapter 2. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 3. Dark Wings, Dark Words. It was something of an old wife's tale, that any news brought by a raven was undoubtedly news that was foul. Elia herself had never taken much stock in that, but at this moment, she couldn't deny that she saw something in it. The news that had come to Sunspear was nothing short of the foulest that she could imagine. By the command of the king, his eldest son and heir, Rhaegar of the House Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, was to be wed to Cersei of the House Lannister, daughter of Lord Tywin Lannister and the Light of the West. The news had hurt so badly, it was almost like someone had stabbed her through the heart with a knife. Her tears had come unbidden, and Elia made no attempt to stem their flow. That night, she had wept and wept and wept. She had met Cersei Lannister before, she had scarce been more than a babe in truth. The Lady Joanna had just died, and Elia and Oberyn and their mother had come all the way to Casterly Rock for a visit. She had known what her mother's plans were, even back then. Apparently when her mother and the Lady Joanna had both been ladies in service to the Queen back when she had only been a princess. She was to wed Jaime Lannister, heir to the Rock, and to be the Lady of Casterly Rock, while Cersei Lannister would have gone south to be wed to Oberyn. That had been her mother's great ambition, to bind Casterly Rock and Sunspear together for all of the ages to come, and yet that plan itself was ruined by the fact that Joanna Lannister had lost a war that it seemed all women would have to face at some point. The War of the Birthing Bed. Word of the Lady Joanna's death reached them when they had just set out from Dawn. Elia had only seen her mother weep once before that, when they had buried her father beneath the old palace, and after that the Princess of Dawn had not shed a single tear, though on her father's name a day mother would grow so very quiet and would be one of the few days that she would not hold court, instead preferring to retreat to her solar and not come out until the day had passed. But when the word of the Lady of Casterly Rock's death reached Lorza Martell's ears, she had wept even more harshly than she had ever wept for her father. She had not even had the time to dismiss the servant who had informed her of the death before her chest had begun to heave with sobs, and she had to bury her face into her hands in order to still her weeping. Oberyn had looked more shocked in that moment than Elia had ever seen him, and it had fallen to her to take control of the situation, dismissing the serving man with a kind word before she had pulled her mother close to her and simply allowed her to weep until she had regained her composure and could finally speak again. She had then dismissed Oberyn and called up a flagon of wine for the both of them. Oberyn had protested and had insisted that he stay, but Elia had convinced him to leave, saying that mother needed some time alone with her to grieve openly and she would not be able to do so if he was there. Mother had never been able to show any weakness to her sons, not once. Always and ever the Princess of Dawn. Oberyn had not been pleased with it, but he had left them then once she had explained it again, saying that mother needed to be able to weep and to feel weak, and yet she would never be able to do that in front of him once she had regained her composure. According to Sir Mamfrey, her brother had spent the rest of the night in a brothel. Elia and her mother had spent the rest of that night drinking deep from the flagon and sending down for 2 more, as well as some meat pies and cheeses and apples to eat. They drank and feasted in their room, and her lady mother had spoken of the Lady Joanna and how much she had meant to her, and of all the wonderful hot summer days that she and her and Queen Rolla had spent in their girlhood together at the Red Keep when they had been summoned to attend it. It was a night filled with tears and laughter and too much wine, and perhaps for the first time Elia was the one to wake up with a hangover while Oberyn was walking around with an almost clear head, for which Oberyn took no end of pleasure in teasing her mercilessly for it. But while a sore head and a smirking Oberyn was a terrible combination, it was completely worth it. Mother had not spoken of it in the morning, nor did she seem to show any sign of the grief that had ravaged her the night before, nor any of the wine that they had drunk, which to Elia did not seem overly fair, considering that she had felt as though an entire column of horses had ran over her the night before when she had finally awoken that morn. But while mother had not spoken of it at all, that did not mean that she had not remembered it. She had patted her head and rubbed her back as she had relished much of what she had eaten the night before into her chamber pot, and had reprimanded Oberyn for teasing her. Mother's eyes had still been dark and red and raw, but they held no more tears then. Indeed, at times it seemed as though the letter had never come at all. She had been quieter than when they had set out from Sunspear, but she did not weep again after that night, though she had not smiled either, and she had a much shorter span of patience with Oberyn than she had before. But it had never been great to start with, but the Princess of Dawn had returned, and any sign of weakness she had shown the night before was gone. They had continued on their way then, taking ship from Ghost Hill and sailing over the Sea of Dawn, landing at Cape Wrath and beginning the journey through the Stormlands proper. Mother had sent out messages 2 weeks before they had left to the Stormlands, to the Reach, to the Crownlands, to the Riverlands and to the Westerlands that her daughter was in need of a husband, and as such once they had left Dawn, many castles were opened to them. They had entered at least a dozen castles in the Stormlands alone, and Elia found that none of the potential matches waiting for her inside were to her liking. Most simply glanced at her up and down and made their mind up in that moment if she would be a suitable wife for them to take. Few of them were rude enough to say anything to her face, but the whispers she heard in their halls spoke of her ill health and plain features and how strange she seemed, how Dawnish. At least they had eaten well, that was something. The men of the Stormlands liked their hunting, and they had the fertile lands to support it. Racks of ribs crusted with garlic and sage, boar bacon and sausage and venison stews and pies and swans stuffed with a hearty mixture of nuts, mushrooms and dates and buttery cheese and fruit tarts for the sweet. It lacked for seasoning in her mind, as north of the mountains it seemed that spice was limited to salt and pepper, but she could not claim for a day of their journey that she had gone hungry. And Oberyn was always there to cheer her up, making mock of all her suitors and not caring a fig if he was overheard. Oberyn had ever been fearless. If any man was offended by his words to the point that he would demand a duel, then Oberyn would simply laugh and call for his spear. Yes, her little brother had no fear for any man or anything, and if Elia could fight like him, if she could move like him when he held a spear, then perhaps she would have no fear either. But she could not claim that her brother had much in the way of wisdom. All was needed was one mistake, one thrust of the spear that was mistimed, and it could spell the end of him. No, at times she wished her little brother was more like Doran, just that little bit more cautious. In truth, she was certain that both of her brothers would be much better suited if the both of them were just a little bit more like the other. Of course her brothers at times could not stand the other, and it oft fell on Elia to keep the peace when they had fallen to an argument, which was often whenever Doran visited from Saltshore, keeping the peace between two such different men as her brothers. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that Doran was his brother, then Elia was fairly sure that Oberyn would have poisoned him by this point. Perhaps that was overstating the point somewhat, but it didn't feel like it when she was caught in the middle with Oberyn screaming at Dorne and Doran scoffing at everything their younger brother said, and her with her headaches growing worse with every argument that they had. For all her brothers claimed to love and protect her, it seemed they were both willfully blind when it came to them hurting her. And yet still she loved them, in spite of the pain and frustration that they both caused to her. Doran and Oberyn were her brothers, and she would lay down her life for them in a heartbeat, as she knew that they would do for her. That still did not change the fact that there were days when she longed to grab both of her brothers by their ears, bash both their heads together, and then lock the both of them in a room together so they could sort it out without her. In truth, she was a little surprised that Doran had not decided to come with them at first, but when she looked back on it she imagined that it only made sense. This wasn't just about finding a husband for Elia. Her mother always seemed to know how to wrangle the most benefit out of every action. She had once overheard Uncle Luwin referring to his sister as more a fishmonger than a princess, haggling over the benefits of a deal with her lords as a fishwife did with a carp. Uncle Luwin hadn't come back to Sunspear for an entire moon's turn after that sally, but when he had returned none had hugged him tighter than Princess Lorza herself. It wasn't as though there was some truth in it. She wasn't sure if she had ever met anyone with more patience than her mother, and she was more than happy to weigh the benefits and drawbacks of every decision before she committed herself to any action. And Doran was just like her in that regard, deliberate and cautious, just like their mother and a man grown and her heir. It had been time for Doran to take his place in the old palace and learn its halls and be ready to take their mother's place as Prince of Dorne when she went to her rest. So Doran had been summoned back from Saltshore while they had prepared for their journey north. But while they had entered many great castles and were entertained by many lords, and Oberyn had made mock of many of them, even to this day she could not stop a snicker from escaping her when she thought of poor sweet Baelor and his unfortunate flatulence and the cruel but amusing name that Oberyn had given him. It didn't change their final destination. It was always going to be Casterly Rock. The first time she had seen it her breath was stolen away. There was no finer castle in the world than Sunspear. She held that as a fact true in her heart, but nothing could compare in grandeur than the seat of House Lannister. It wasn't a castle that had been built by the hands of man but the hands of the gods, a massive rock that jutted out from the sea with a ring fort and towers carved near the top. This was the heart of the Lannister power, not just being their seat and so fierce to look upon that Visenya Targaryen herself had said during the conquest that she was glad that the king of the Westerlands had chosen to yield, as she did not think even with her siblings dragons could they burn the Lannisters out, but also where a great deal of their gold came from, the mines buried deep under the hard stone like graveworms through the rotting flesh of a corpse. It amazed her and disquieted her all at the same time. If nothing else, she was uncertain if she would enjoy staying there. Her health had never been the strongest, to say the very least. Many days in her childhood were wasted away behind the walls of Sunspear or the Water Gardens, while other children her own age played in the narrow alleys of the Shadow City or the pools of the gardens. The thought of staying and having to do what would surely be a massive amount of climbing did not sweet well with her. Thankfully, most of those fears were soothed. A small host of Lord Tywin's household knights met them on the road, halfway between Lannisport and the Rock. Bands of black silk wrapped around their upper arms, showing that their entire household was in mourning. Sir Kevan Lannister was at the head of the knights. His round face was grey and drawn and his eyes had a hint of redness to them. Their greeting was polite and respectful, but, quite understandable considering the circumstances, could not be called warm. They were escorted into the Rock itself, and Lord Tywin had not been there to greet them, but the majority of the House Lannister household was, all of them dressed in black and their faces were pale. Something heavy hung in the air, a storm that had not yet arrived. Both of the Lannister twins were there, and if not for their dress then Elia was not certain if she would be able to tell the two of them apart. Were one born the same sex as the other, then she was certain she would not be able to. They both had the same manes of golden curls which framed their pale faces. They both had the same green eyes and the same pale skin with faint freckles going over the bridge of their noses. No, the only real difference was how they carried themselves. Jaime Lannister seemed barely able to stand, The green of his eyes were framed by redness, and it was clear to her that he had been crying not long before he had been summoned down to come and greet them. The Lady Circea was different. Sorrow was not the word she thought of when she took in the little lady of Casterly Rock. Rage, that was the first word that came into her mind the first time she had seen Cersei Lannister. Her fists were clutching her skirts so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she was biting her bottom lip so hardly that Elia was worried that she might cause herself to bleed. Her eyes were red from tears that had been shed before as well, but while sorrow burned in her brother's eyes there was not a trace of it in hers. No, rage was all that she saw in Cersei Lannister's eyes, rage and hate that should not exist in any child so young. Elia could only think that it must have been the loss of her lady mother that had brought such a strength of hatred up in the young girl, but Elia did not think she could fully understand that, when her father died, she had been heartbroken and spent much of her time weeping into the sheets and pillows of her bed. But then, she should not have judged the girl on her own experiences with grief. Oberyn had burned and raged with grief as well when the Maester had come to tell them that father had slipped away in the night. The fact that he had done so in his own bed with his own wife warm and safe had done little to soothe her brother, and he had screamed at the Maester to get out. Elia had been unable to give him any sort of comfort, try as she might. She hadn't been able to give herself any comfort. She had barely been able to breathe after the Maester had told them. It took all she had to not break down sobbing. Oberyn had not spared a thought to her. He had stormed out of the room and out of the castle and out into the Shadow City. It took the guards 3 days to find him, stone drunk and in the bed of one of the most expensive whores of the Shadow City. The headache he would have for the next 3 days was certain to be punishment enough, but Princess Lorza had him dragged before her, and Elia was certain that to this day she could still hear the ringing of her ears from the sound of her mother's shouts. But while Oberyn had raged with grief and Elia simply allowed herself to feel it, Doran and Mother withdrew into themselves and would not allow anyone to see them for days and days at a time. It seemed as though the Lord of Casterly Rock was much the same in that regard, as Lord Tywine had not attended them for even a single day of their visit, leaving their comfort into the hands of the eldest of his younger brothers. But while Lord Tywine might not have shown his face to them when they were there in the rock, his presence was felt in every stone, in every inch of the seat of House Lannister. It was older than House Lannister in point of fact. It had belonged to House Casterly before the first Lannisters had put all of them to the sword, or Lan the Clever bedded all the maids of Casterly so they would have his children if you went with the songs. But for all of that it seemed as though Lord Tywine had built the rock himself, for how keenly his presence was felt. Her mother had gone to him every morning, evening and night for every day they had remained there. She did not eat with the rest of them in the great hall of Casterly Rock. She took her meals with Lord Tywine, and for all the time they were there they did not seem to leave the other's side. At the time, when she was younger and naive and knew less of the world, she had thought that they were simply sharing stories of the Lady Joanna, taking comfort in one another in the sharing of the memories they had of her. The truth was not something so sweet. The haggling was being done in that room that would see her wed to the eldest son of Casterly Rock, who at the time was a boy of barely 8. She would have to wait a while before she was wed, of course, till Jaime Lannister turned 16 or around that, and when Elia was practically going to be an old woman, near to 30. It seemed however that it was not to be that she and young Jaime would be wed after all. Lord Tywine was as much a mountain as his rock and he would not be budged. It seemed that whatever Lady Joanna had hoped and planned had not mattered much to her husband now that she was gone, if it ever did. Had the Lady of House Lannister still been alive, then perhaps she, when working with her mother, could have convinced the Lion to see the match through. But Joanna Lannister was dead, and who could truly say what would have been different if she still lived? Perhaps nothing would be different if Lord Tywine saw no true advantage in the match, but then again who could actually say? All that was made clear to her after the fact was that she was not to be betrothed to Jaime after all, and Oberyn would not be betrothed to Cersei either. Which to be sure she was glad of. Jaime was a sweet boy, but she did not fancy waiting so long for she was wed, nor did she much fancy a husband that was that younger than her. Oberyn was also glad of it, as he did not seem too much like Cersei either, and she was happy enough with that, as Elia did not think that she would want someone like her to be her good sister. She had not been rude throughout their visit of Casterly Rock. No, the worst she had shown to them through the majority of their visit was a sense of disinterest. But she had seen the worst of her when Oberyn had asked about the monster. All throughout their journey they had heard the tales of the creature that had killed Lord Tywine's wife as it was born. A red squalling little thing, born with no skin and a long black leathery tail with no eyes and a pair of wings like a moth and more teeth than could fit into his mouth, all of them sharp and ending into points. According to one of the tales they had heard as they had made their journey, the little demon had been born starving, and after having made a feast of his mother's innards he had bitten off the hand of the midwife who had pulled him free. It was like something out of a story told to terrify children, and many of them were different. Some had said that the demon of Casterly Rock had been born with eyes burned like brands, or had claws where hands should have been. A septon in a small town they had passed through had been preaching that the monster had been born to Lord Tywine so that he might be made humble, to remember that no man may stand higher than the king. She did not see how a deformed child could be punishment. Surely such a thing was simply punishment for the child itself. And what of the Lady Joanna? What crime has she committed that was so terrible that she deserved to be torn apart by the birthing of a babe? It seemed so terrible unfair, and even to this day it saddened her to think of. But Oberyn had only wanted to see the monster. It had been one of the first things he had asked when they were all of them sit around a table together to eat. Jaime Lannister had frowned and had turned his gaze down to his plate, saying nothing at all, but his twin had only smiled, the first smile that Elia had seen the girl give, and it was small and cruel, sharp as a dagger blade. All she had said to Oberyn's request to see the child was a nod and a promise that she would show them later. Every day that passed during their stay had Oberyn asking again and again to see it, and all that Cersei had to say to him was that it would be soon enough, that soon they would both be able to see the monster. The day when it finally came was on the night before their last day at Casterly Rock. Cersei had come to them with her brother following behind her in tow, with a candle clutched in her hand, with the flame making her green eyes seem to glow in the darkness. They made their way through the long cold halls of Casterly Rock till they came to a set of stairs that did not seem to have any end at all. It was dark and dim and cold. She had been dressed in a nightgown when the twins had came to collect them, and it was not overly thick, so it did little to keep out the cold, and thus she had to hold herself as she walked to try and bear the brunt of the cold. They kept walking into the dark, the light of Cersei Lannister's candle the only way they had to see it. Were it to be extinguished, Elia did not think they would be able to find their way back to the higher levels of the castle. At some point after walking what seemed so far that Elia had to assume that they were deep below the rock, there was a cry. It was a wail of absolute misery and fear, and it made Elia's heart ache to hear it. She didn't know what had possessed her, but it forced her to run down the stairs and past Jaime and Oberyn and Cersei, even as the younger girl shouted for her to come back. The stairs came to an end in a small passageway that Elia had run down her heart hammering in her chest, and every breath she took almost hurt, and with every step she took made the crying louder and louder. There could have been no mistaking it, it was a babe. A babe that had been left all alone in the cold and the dark. Who could let that happen? A door was waiting for her, small and the same color of the wall it was built into, so that she nearly missed it. Were it not for the babe's cries, then Elia was quite certain that she would have missed it. Elia was quite certain looking back that she did not actually need to throw herself at the door in order to open it, but at that moment, she hadn't wanted to waste any time. A cry of shock was what met her as she threw herself inside, and an old wet nurse jumped out of her wooden chair, settled next to a crib. Her grey eyes had widened and she had stepped closer to the crib, to perhaps protect what was held within, and again as Elia looked back she could understand. Bursting through the door with her eyes wide and her chest heaving, she imagined that she must have seemed quite fearsome. Cersei and both of their brothers had chosen that moment to walk in, and the younger girl had spoken of how she had brought them to see her brother. The wet nurse had tried to send them all away, saying that Lord Tywine had given orders that the babe was to be left alone and none was to see him. Cersei had responded by telling the older woman to get out of her way, calling her nothing more than a milk cow, and that the babe belonged to her, and if she did not leave then she would her guards kill her. The old woman's face had paled and half ran, half stumbled out of the room and slammed the door shut behind her. Elia frowned and was about to tell the girl that what she had said was awful, but Cersei walked over to the crib and rested her shoulder against it before she looked back at them with a grin on her face while beckoning them closer. When Elia looked down into the crib, she was fairly certain that she had fallen in love at that moment. To be sure, the babe was deformed and would just as like not live for long, but that did not mean that he deserved to be locked away in the dark for all his life, be it short or long. And there were no wings nor any pointed teeth nor a tail. The head was a little too big for the body, his limbs were a little bit too short, and one eye was black while the other was green, but this was no monster. Just a baby, hungry and cold. Oberyn had said it best, quick and to the point as ever when he looked into the crib and let out a disappointed groan, his eyes narrowing in disappointment. "That's not a monster," He had spoken as he glanced down at Circe, his hands crossed over his chest, and spoke to her like he thought that she was a lackwit. "That's just a baby." The sharp gasp that left Circe's mouth had made it clear that she did not approve of either of their reactions, but Elia could not find it in herself to care as she stared down at the babe with a smile on her face, watching as his stubby little arms waved and his legs kicked. He was such a sweet little thing. There had still been traces of tears in his eyes, but he cooed when he looked up at Elia, and in that moment all she had wanted to do was pick him up and take him away from this terrible place. Before she had been able to do anything, however, Cersei Lannister had let out a scream of frustration and stormed over to the crib, pushing Elia out of the way, and made her stumble back, and Oberyn came forward to steady her, and the elder of the Lannister twins began to scream that he was a monster, that he was going to die and that he should not have lived this long. As his elder sister's voice got louder and louder, the babe began to wail harder and harder. Cersei spun then, her entire body tight, as she reached down and began to pinch the babe harshly, his arms and his stomach, and then between his legs, and the wails that once were born of hunger and coldness was now born of pain, and Elia was about to step forward and pull her back and tell her to stop, but Jaime Lannister had stepped forward and seized hold of his sister's arm before she had a chance to. Cersei had squirmed and tried to pull her arm free from her twin's grasp, but it was clear that the heir to Casterly Rock had no intention of letting go. While Jaime was dealing with that, Elia hurried back over to the crib and looked the babe over. He would have bruises to be certain, but it didn't look like any lasting damage had been done. She reached down and picked the babe up and held him close to her chest and did what little she could do to soothe his tears. Cersei had pulled herself free by this point and stormed over to the door and threw it open before slamming it shut behind her. The babe let out a whimper at the noise, but he did not break out crying again, and Elia was going to take that as a victory. They spent roughly another hour in the little nursery before Sir Kevan came and found them, a small frown of distaste on his face as he spoke to them with tones of iron as he asked them to come back with him to the castle proper. Elia pressed a kiss to the smooth forehead of the babe and placed him gently back in the crib before following the rest of them out. Even after they had left the next morning, Elia had not forgotten that little baby all alone in the dark, and she prayed that he would find some happiness in the world, and she didn't forget Cersei Lannister either. How cruel and full of rage she had been, how quick she had been to hurt her own brother and a little baby as well. And now that girl was to wed Rhaegar Targaryen. Her mother had not been able to secure a marriage between her own children and the children of Casterly Rock, and when they had left from the rock she did not think she had ever seen mother as angry as she had done that morning. But when King Aerys had reached out to them with the offer to have Elia wed the prince, Princess Lorza had smiled despite the pain that had been ravaging her for so very long. A small part of Elia was glad that her mother had not lived to see this, to see the offer of making her a queen be snatched away and given instead to the daughter of the man who had spat on what the friendship she had formed with Lady Joanna. She would have been spitting with rage and already thinking of a way to make them pay for it with a gentle touch that made it seem as though she had done nothing at all. And while in most cases Doran was more like their mother than any of them, it seemed as though he was not like her in that case. To be certain he had disapproved, but if Doran was plotting something then he made no indication to her, and in truth Elia was glad of that. She had been angry and heartbroken when the word had come to them, but she had no stomach for plotting and even less for revenge. Let this be the end of it. The door to her room opened then, and she had looked up, expecting it to be Oberyn or Doran, as only her brothers would come into her apartments without announcing themselves or seeking her permission, but it was in fact neither of her brothers but instead the closest thing she had to a sister. Ashura Dane was lovely, with her long black hair and her violet eyes and her soft smile. She was beauty incarnate. Ashura. The name slipped out as she jumped from her bed and threw her arms around Ashura's neck and held her close to her, and Ashura held her back and held her even more tightly than Elia was doing to her. I am so very glad to see you, you know that I am, but what are you doing here? Why aren't you at Starfall? Doran sent us a raven, he asked that I attend you when you go north. Elia could go and kiss her brother right now, she would do her duty as it was expected of her, but that did not mean that she did not have fear in her for what was to come. To go as far north as North went, away from all of those that loved her and would protect her. An honor guard would escort her, but they would be heading back to Dorne as soon as the wedding was done. If Ashura was going to be with her, then she could do this. She was certain enough of that. 1,000 things had to be done. She had to speak with Ashura properly, and she wanted to ask about Lauren. Had her friend brought her daughter with her, or did she leave her at Starfall? More trunks still had to be packed, and she had so many worries and fears that she wanted to confess to her friend and have them be soothed, but that could all wait until later. For now, she simply enjoyed the embrace and shut her eyes and allowed herself to simply remember happier memories of her girlhood, when Ashura would come and sit with her inside while all the other children played on without her. End of Chapter 3. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 4. Ned sighed as he stood outside of his father's solar nervously. Speaking to his father was never normally this difficult for him, but right now it seemed as if it was the most difficult thing imaginable. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door and waited for his father's voice to call him in from the other side. Ricard Stark was a large man, wide shoulders and as tall as two men standing on one another's shoulders. Despite this, Ned knew that his father was a gentle man, but even so he couldn't help but still get a twinge of the same fear he had held for the man ever since he was a child and he had seen him execute a deserter from the wall. "Hello Eddard, what is it that you want?" his father asked as he glanced up from the letter that he was writing. "Father, must I marry Elia Martell? I do not know her and she's a princess and I am only a second son. I would not have a wife who would resent me." And Ned stopped talking as Ricard held up his hand to stop him. "Eddard, I am disappointed in you. I expected you to be better than your siblings and do what is expected of you. Brandon and Lyanna continually disappoint me, but I expect better than that from you. You will marry Elia Martell and I expect to hear nothing more on the subject. Do you understand?" Ricard asked as he drew himself to his full height. Ned bowed his head. "Of course father, I understand." He chewed on his bottom lip for a moment before speaking again. "Who are you writing to?" "Lord Robert and Lady Caitlin. I am inviting them for your wedding. I am hoping that if your siblings spend a little time with them both, then they may be able to come to terms with the fact that this is happening whether they like it or not." Ricard sighed heavily. "Now if you will excuse me, these letters won't write themselves." "Of course father, I won't bother you." Ned bowed his head again and spun on his feet to leave, as soon as he opened the door and was about to step outside, but before he could leave his father sighed once again and told him to close the door and sit down. "I know how it feels Ned, believe me I do understand. I did not want to marry your mother at first, I did not love her and yet I was being forced to marry her." Ricard stood up and walked over to the fireplace where a fire was still blazing away. "I was certain that it would be impossible for me to make her happy and she would grow to resent me and I her." Ned was more than a little surprised. It had been years since his father had even mentioned his mother, and if any of them tried to he would become extremely upset and would forbid them from speaking of her. "But you did grow to love one another?" For a moment Ricard was silent. "I am afraid that it was impossible for me to love her as she deserved to be loved. But we had a duty that needed to be done and familiarity breeds contempt, and in time I grew to love her as the mother of my children and a dear friend whose advice I grew to respect and cherish." Ricard sat back down and stared intently at his son. "You may never love Elia as a wife and she may never love you as a husband. I hope that you do. I pray that you do, but if you do not, then you will love the children she will give you, and like your mother and I before, you will find some common ground there and you will come to respect her as a noble companion." Ned nodded and stood up from his chair. "Thank you father, you've given me a great deal to think about. I will leave you to your writing." He left the room quickly and closed the door behind him. He needed to speak to his siblings, both about what his father had told him and about their respective betrotheds coming earlier than expected. Hopefully he would be able to soften the blow for them both. Underscore 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 underscore. Rhaegar Targaryen frowned heavily as he heard his mother scream from her room in the maiden vault as his father delivered his tender ministrations. He would give anything to make his father stop, but two men of the Kingsguard, whom he could not identify due to their heavy helms, stood outside the door and they would stop him before he could do anything about it. He sighed and knelt down next to Viserys and ran his long fingers through his silver hair and began to hum a song that would calm him. He wasn't as close to his younger brother as he should be, but he remembered what it was like to have to listen to his father hurt their mother, and he knew that he would have done anything to be comforted back then, so the least he could do now was comfort his little brother now. Viserys eventually calmed down and fell asleep against his chest just as Rhaegar heard the door open down the hallway. He could hear his father angrily muttering as he walked down the corridor and the sound of the armored boots of the knights echoing down the hall as well. When the sound faded away, Rhaegar picked up his sleeping brother gently and walked down the hall and entered the room. He sighed heavily as he placed Viserys down on his mother's lounger and he walked over to where she was hunched over on the floor. He gently lifted her head and sighed heavily and he stared at the ugly black swelling on her eye which ruined her beautiful skin. "Oh mother." R'hllor shook her head despite the fact that both her eyes were filling with tears. "It does not matter, Rhaegar, I am well. Father shouldn't be able to do this to you." He protested weakly even though he knew that it didn't matter that his father shouldn't be able to, it would not stop him. R'hllor got to her feet with her son supporting her, she walked over to her lounger and sat down next to the still sleeping Viserys. She ran her fingers through his hair and smiled down at him sadly. "It is nothing, I am not used to, my son, do not worry for me." Rhaegar bit his lip and looked upon his sweet mother who was bound to a monster, her own brother who had been abusing her for years, and made a decision. "Do not worry mother, it won't always be like this. Not for much longer. Not if Tywin Lannister comes through for me," he thought as his mother wiped her head around to stare at him. "Rhaegar, do nothing foolish," she warned as he started to walk out of the room. "It is already in motion mother." Rhaegar whispered so she would not hear as he left the room. He could only hope that he would live to see his mother and brother and the kingdom free of his father's poisonous influence. End of Chapter 4. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 5. As soon as they arrived in the north, Elia was freezing. She knew that the north would be cold and had brought thick furs for exactly that reason as had Ashura, but there was knowing what the cold was and then actually feeling. She clutched the 3 furs that she wore close to her to try and stave off the cold that penetrated the wheelhouse. This was to her home now, this frozen wasteland where there were dozens of miles with nothing around but farms or a small inn in the distance. She took a deep breath to stave off the tears she felt as she remembered the life she could have had. She was a princess of House Martell. She would not bend or break over something that would never be. It had taken them around a month, but they were nearing Winterfell. Only a few more moments and they would arriving at the road that would take them to the ancient castle. Elia took another deep breath to soothe the nervous quiver in her stomach, and in a moment her stomach settled. A chorus of coos and happy squeals caught her attention and Elia smiled as her eyes drifted to Lorien, who was sitting in her mother's lap, her little legs kicking happily and her grey eyes bright and curious. Lorien was one of the happiest babies that Elia had ever seen, and it took until they had picked her up from Starfall that Elia had remembered quite how much she had missed her, and she could tell by the way that Ashura had run and embraced her daughter that she had missed her too. Despite being happy with the little girl's presence, it was a bittersweet joy. Looking at her brought back memories of those she had left behind. Arianne, Little Tystain, Oberyn, Nym and little Tyon, how she missed them all, and her heart ached that she could be with them again. The goodbye had been painful and full of tears on both sides. Except for Oberyn, who had stormed off, her sorrow a hard emotion for her to deal with, so it had become anger. She missed them greatly. When the Maester had told that her illness would make it difficult for her to bear children, her heart had broken. She had wanted to be a mother more than anything else, and though the Maester had tried to comfort her by reassuring her that she could still have children, it would just be more difficult for her. The damage had been done. She couldn't help but remember how Oberyn reacted when he had found out, and that the Maester had made her cry. He had taken up his spear and threatened the poor old man to a duel to the death. If it hadn't been for Doran, he probably would have gone through with it as well. For as long as Elia could remember, Oberyn had been her protector. Despite the fact he was younger than her, he had always protected her from everyone and everything that would do her harm. Doran had protected her as well, but in different ways. And now she was away from her protectors, away from everyone she had ever loved aside from Ashura and daughter. She took another breath and blinked her eyes to try and clear away the tears. She would not cry. She would not cry. Ashura took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, and Elia looked up and saw the comforting smile on her pretty face. That smile and her eyes said 1,000 words. Even through the wheelhouse was silent except for the sounds of a happy child. Elia smiled and nodded and looked out the window, her eyes widen at what she saw. Winterfell. She had heard of it and even seen 1 or 2 drawings of it, but now she was seeing it in real life and she could hardly believe it. It seemed ancient, like it had been where it stood for thousands and thousands of years, and it would continue to stand for thousands more. The stone of the castle was grey and its towers stretched into the sky. It did not have the luxury or the elegance of the water gardens or Sunspear, but it had its own charm. It was mysterious and ancient, and as she looked at it she got the feeling that it held 1,000 mysteries, and even if she spent the rest of her life within those stone walls, that she would never discover them all. The wheelhouse and their escort rode into the castle through the main gate, and they then came to a stop. A Dornish man dressed in armor of a captain opened the door and held out his hand to help them out. The poor man was clearly freezing and miserable, and she could understand why. He only wore leather armor and a very thin wool fur. Elia took his hand and let him help her out and turned to face the wide open space they had ridden into. Underneath the covered bridge stood the people who were to be her new family. She took another deep breath and decided to be bold. She began to walk over to them. She heard several of her countrymen and servants carrying her luggage following after her, and they stopped short as she did, a few steps in front of the Starks. A true beast of a man, the largest man that Elia had ever seen, and that was including the mountain, stepped forward, and despite his intimidating appearance his eyes held a kindness and a wisdom that made her relax. Elia held out her hand and he gently took it and kissed it. "Princess Elia, I am truly honored to have you here." "I am honored and overjoyed to be here, Lord Rickard," Elia said with a gentle smile. She looked down the line of people that were greeting her, and she smiled gently when she saw that her soon-to-be husband was standing next to his father, despite that usually in a situation such as this the father's heir would standing next to the father. Eddard Stark was nowhere near as tall as his father, but Elia did not mind that. He was still tall, but only a few inches taller than Oberyn, but wide-shouldered where Oberyn was slim. The young man, while not overly handsome all things considered, was by no means ugly, his face strongly shaped, his chin covered with heavy stubble, and his grey eyes pleasant enough to look at. His brown hair reminded her somewhat of some of the sand in Dorne. He seemed to stare right through her. She imagined that was as he pleased with this arrangement as she was. "A pleasure to meet you, Lord Stark. I hope that I am not a disappointment to you." Eddard shook his and spoke quietly, his voice gruff though not unpleasant. "I could not see how you would ever be a disappointment, my lady." Elia nodded and stepped over to the next person in line. As first introductions went, it wasn't as bad as she feared. The next person in line was Brandon Stark the heir, and while his younger brother was certainly not bad looking in any regard, it was clear that Brandon was the one who got the looks, with striking blue eyes and brown hair so dark it was almost black, and a face that looked like the gods had carved it from marble, as well as strong muscles and a wide chest. It was clear to see why so many girls were so mad with desire for the so-called wild wolf. He was polite to her and even told a joke that his brother had been born frowning and serious, and while it was not particularly funny it did make her laugh. Through she did notice in the corner of her eye that Eddard did seem to tense up. Despite being polite and speaking to her, his attention seemed to be drawn to Ashura, who had come to stand behind her, or more specifically Lauren, who Ashura held in her arms. It couldn't be, could it? It was difficult to tell. Ashura had purple eyes, so her daughter didn't get her eyes from her, and she and Lauren both had dark black hair, and both mother and daughter had similar facial features, making it difficult to identify any father. But the way that Lord Brandon was staring at them both. Elia quickly decided that it wasn't her business and moved down the line. The person standing in front of her this time was Lord Rickard's only daughter, Lyanna Stark. The girl was lovely, with long dark hair and the same grey eyes as her older brother and father, and a figure that was well on its way to becoming a woman's. Despite this, the girl greeted her rather coldly with a simple and quick shake of the hand instead of the formal kiss, and Elia got the feeling that she didn't like her very much. The final person who greeted her, a young boy around 10 years old with sandy brown hair and grey eyes, Benjen Stark, the youngest child. He was a sweet boy and kissed Elia's hand gently, and Elia could tell that she liked him already. Once the introductions were spoken, Lord Rickard spoke up. "Now then, Lyanna, if you would please show Princess Elia and Lady Ashura to their rooms. They will be tired from their journey. I will send a servant to fetch you ladies for when our guests arrive, and then we shall go to the Godswood so you and my son can say your vows, and then will be the feast. Brandon. Eddard, come with me, there are still things to discuss." Lord Rickard walked off after giving a respectful nod to both Elia and Ashura, Ned and Brandon following after him. Lyanna sighed before walking off. She turned to look overhead at both Elia and Ashura. "Follow me then." Elia and Ashura shot a look at one another and followed the northern girl. They got the feeling that at least one Stark did not want them here. As they walked after her and Elia's servants followed, she suddenly had a strange feeling, as if someone somewhere was watching her. Judging her. But as she looked around to see if she could see anyone, she could see no one at all. Just the wind, perhaps. End of Chapter 5. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 6. Ned was sitting in the main hall to help his father and the servants in making sure that everything was ready for the feast and their guests. It wasn't just Robert and Caitlin Tully coming to the wedding after all. Several northern houses were coming as well: Umber, Carstark, Mormont, Reed, Marndale, Forrester, Whitehill and even Bolton. The main head was going to under siege and he didn't like that. It was mainly due to him. It was his wedding that was bringing this chaos down onto his home, and he had hoped that the wedding itself would have been a quiet affair, but looking back he realized that had been somewhat of a naive hope. Of course the other houses were invited. He may have been the second son, but he was marrying a princess, as well as the fact that this would create a link to Dawn where before there had been nothing at all. Speaking of his bride, he had been more than a little surprised. He had seen Elia Martell before, but it was always across the way in crowded ballrooms. He had expected a woman dressed in the finest silks and dripping in gold and jewels. And while her clothes were obviously finely made and not something a farmer could buy for his daughter, they were nothing that suggested royalty and were actually fairly practical, at least for a southern noble. His bride-to-be was also stunningly beautiful. Most men spoke of Cersei Lannister or Catelyn Tully or Ashara Dayne, which had been a surprise to Ned, through not a completely unpleasant one, and while all these women were certainly visions of loveliness, Elia in her own way was something else. Long curled black hair, dark olive skin and full lips with eyes so brown that they were almost black. Her beauty was different and contrasted beautifully with the pale greyness of Winterfell. He hoped that he had not seemed too cold when they conversed. He did not wish for her to think that he was unhappy with her. He had simply been shy. Was she happy with him? How could she be? She was a princess and she was going to marry him, not Brandon. Handsome Brandon, brave Brandon, Brandon the heir. He was simply Ned, and he could not see how that would be enough for her. He sighed heavily. He imagined that most husbands weren't this depressed on the day of their wedding, or at least they weren't depressed for quite these reasons. The sound of gentle footsteps and annoyed murmuring quickly drew him out of his thoughts. Lyanna had a look of annoyance on her face, and Ned had been dreading this. He had hoped that perhaps his sister would surprise him, but it seemed that just like how she hated Robert for being her betrothed and how she hated Catelyn for being Brandon's betrothed, she now hated Elia for being his betrothed. "Did you show Princess Elia and Lady Ashara to their chamber?" he asked as his sister stopped next to him, and annoyed expression grew even darker. "Why was I forced to do that? Isn't it a servant's work?" Lyanna asked with a huff, and she played with a loose thread on her blue dress. It was an old dress, and their father had been furious when she showed up in the courtyard wearing it. He had tried to send her back to her room to change, but by then the Dornish host had arrived. "I do not know if you have noticed, Lya, but they have been rather busy lately," Ned said as he tilted his head over to where a group of servants were laying down the plates on one of the great long tables, and to where another 3 servants were having to work together to hand the chandelier. "Besides, it was polite and more respectful for you to do it. What do you think of my new wife, by the way?" "She's a snob, Ned, just like all Southerners. Did you see the look on her face when I didn't kiss her hand? Like I stabbed a puppy in front of her," Lyanna said with a roll of her eyes before she quickly snatched up a mug of ale from a serving girl who quickly ran by. The girl looked back and looked like she was about to say something before she ran off. Ned could not keep the heavy frown off of his face. Ned loved his little sister dearly, and he knew that she was a good person at heart, but it was clear to him and quite a great deal of people that she had been spoiled rotten. When she had been younger, their father had very rarely said no to her, neither had he or Brandon, to be fair. The only person who ever told her no was their mother, and it was clear to him that they should have followed her example more closely. He missed his mother. She had been kind and gentle, but with a strength inside of her that made a formidable foe to any who dared challenge her, and a wisdom that made it clear as to why her husband had often sought her counsel. He still couldn't believe that she was gone. Even the heavens seemed to weep for her as the day they interred her into the crypts there had been a snowstorm that even old Nan had said she had not seen the likes of in her life. "You should have kissed her hand, Lyanna. She's a princess and it's tradition, and I do not think she was judging you. Simply confused as to what she had done to upset you," Ned said, and felt his frown deepen as Lyanna simply rolled her eyes and took a sip of her ale. "Try and be kind to her. She is in a strange land and far away from all she knows and loves. She does not need you to be cruel to her on top of that." That at least seemed to have struck a chord. Lyanna sighed and placed her mug down on one of the tables. "All right, Ned, I will try and be nice to her, but only if she is nice to me. I would expect nothing less," Ned said with a smirk. It was progress at least. Lyanna then gave him a quick hug and left the room, most likely to go and spar with Benjen. Ned shook his head to see if there was nothing to busy himself with until tonight. His father was sitting at the table on the dais working with Maester. Clearly, even with the size of the great hall, it would be a problem finding room for everyone. Just as he was about to walk over and ask if there was anything that he could do to help, he was stopped by the sound of a bellowing voice filling the air. Ned. Ned turned his head and couldn't help but grin at the sight of his best friend walking into the great hall like he owned it. Robert Baratheon was like something out of a maiden's fantasy, with strong muscles, striking blue eyes and dark black hair with a full beard. He was always larger than life, and he had a massive grin on his face as walked over to his foster brother and pulled him into a hug. "Damn, Ned, it's been too long. And you lucky dog, you. Marrying a princess. Not that I can blame you, through who wouldn't want to be married to Elia Martell. She's beautiful, and you know what they say about Dornish women, as beautiful as ladies and as skilled as whores," Robert said with a grin, and Ned could only sigh. He loved Robert like a brother, but it was clear that he hadn't changed much. "Robert, would you please not call my future wife a whore?" Ned said, and Robert raised an eyebrow in confusion. It was just a joke, and it wasn't as if he could be that attached to the serpent already. They wouldn't even lay together until later on tonight anyway. "Lord Robert." Ned and Robert both turned their heads to see Lord Rickard approaching with the master following behind. "Please forgive me for not coming to greet you. We have all been busy preparing for Eddard's wedding." "Not a problem at all, Lord Rickard. I only came with a few men. Your servants most likely did not notice me coming. Looks like it will be quite an evening." "You'll finally be a man tonight, Ned." Ned sighed again, and he noticed that his father had a small frown on his face, clearly not liking Robert's bluntness. "And speaking of weddings, where is my lovely bride-to-be?" "Why, she's..." Rickard's brow furrowed as he looked around the hall. Not seeing his daughter, he closed eyes and sighed while rubbing his eyes tiredly. "Eddard." His father spoke, his voice equal parts tired and annoyed. "Where is your sister?" "I am not certain, father. I believe she might have gone to spar with Ben." Ned spoke, and his father let out a breath through his clenched teeth. He was clearly stressed, and the Maester was clearly concerned about it, going by the look on his face. "Brandon!" Lord Rickard shouted, and Brandon, who had been talking to a busty young servant girl with brown hair, turned to face his father. "Go and find your sister and bring her here. Tell her future husband would like to see her." Brandon clearly looked annoyed about being sent on an errand, but he knew better than to argue, and he soon left the hall. As soon as Brandon left the hall, a servant walked in and walked over to his lord. "Lord Stark, forgive me for interrupting, but the Tully host is coming up the road now." "I see, Eddard, I will be back in a moment." Rickard left the hall, and the Maester followed loyally after him. Robert waited until his friend's father was out of sight, and then he threw an arm around Ned's shoulder. "So, I take it you're pleased with your new wife then, Ned?" Robert asked with a grin. "Already had a sample, Ned. There's no harm in it after all. You marrying her tonight anyway. Who cares if there's already a babe in her belly before you say the words in front of your crying tree?" Ned sighed again and was about to say something that he would probably regret later, but he was spared when Brandon walked back into the great hall with Lyanna and Benjen following after him, and then all of Robert's attention was on to Lyanna, who looked furious, though she seemed to be attempting to hide, however poorly. "My lady," Robert breathed. "You're even more beautiful than I imagined." He gently took her hand and gave it a kiss. "I cannot wait for us to bedwed. I ensure you that I will do all that is necessary to ensure your happiness." "Thank you, my lord, that is very sweet of you," Lyanna said, even though it was clear by the look on her face that she didn't believe what he was saying. Robert didn't seem to notice, however, as he simply smiled brightly, clearly pleased that he thought he had pleased her. At that moment Rickard walked back in with the Maester and Lady Catelyn, as well as her sister Lady Lysa and several Tully men behind him. Lady Catelyn was truly stunning, with her lovely red hair tied into a braid and her stunning blue eyes like a river and a warm smile on her lips. Her was quitter and thus seemed to fade more into the background, but she was no less lovely, with the same red hair and blue eyes and an youthful enthusiasm which was quite infectious. "Lord Brandon, I have missed you a great deal," Catelyn said softly and with a sweet smile. "Have you missed me?" For some reason the hope in her voice broke Ned's heart, perhaps because that he knew that whatever his brother said to her, he knew the true answer. Brandon was utterly uninterested in the woman and had nothing kind to say about her. "My lady, how could I not?" Brandon said with his typical smile, the one that charmed all the women and infuriated all the boys and was as false as Walder Frey's teeth. Few people had seen Brandon's real smile. Ned, Lyanna and Benjen were the only ones that Ned was aware of. But Caitlin was blissfully oblivious and her lovely face colored with a pretty blush, and again Ned felt a pang of pity in his heart. Brandon would not keep to one bed, he was certain of that. Poor Lady Caitlin would be forced to brunt that shame of her husband dishonoring her again, and it would unfairly be considered her fault by the people. If she was a good and true wife, then she would have no problem keeping her husband to her bed after all. Are you looking forward to your wedding, Lord Eddard? Isn't it so exciting? Lysa Tully cooed as she glanced around at the main hall. For a moment you would think that was to be the bride today. I wish I was getting married. Father wants me to marry some old lord that asked for my hand. Apparently he's one of my father's trusted vassals. At least he's a lord. Do you remember the look on father's face when you told him that you wanted to marry Petter? Caitlin said with a smile and a shake of her head at her sister's foolish behavior, not noticing how her sister suddenly frowned darkly. Just because you think you're too good for him. She muttered so no one would hear her. At any rate, Lyanna, please show the ladies Tully to their room for the night. Brandon, please do the same for Lord Robert. Ricard commanded in his lordly tone that meant he was not to be disobeyed. You want me to show Lord Robert to their room? Brandon said with a smirk, and Robert guffawed with laughter and Lyanna grinned widely, and while Lady Caitlin and Lady Lysa both tried to act scandalized, it was clear to them that they saw the funny side as they couldn't keep the grins off of their faces. Even Ned couldn't help but smile a little. Even their father seemed amused, though he was clearly trying to hide it behind mask of lordly and fatherly disapproval. Please show Lord Baratheon to his own room, Brandon, and your sister come back here. There is still much to do before the wedding tonight. Yes, father. Both siblings said and left the room with their guests following after them. As soon as they left, Ricard placed his hand on his second son's shoulder. I can see that you are nervous. Don't be, everything will be fine. I promise you. You can't promise something like that, father. You cannot know that everything will be fine. Ned lamented with a sad sigh. If only one could know the future, then you would know if everything would be fine, or at least you could take steps to prevent it. But such power was lost to them years ago. Ricard sighed and shook his head. Come, there is still much work to do. He walked back to the table on the raised platform with his son and the maester following behind him. Underscore 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 underscore. You look so beautiful, Elia. Ashura breathed with tears in her eyes. For little Lauren said with a smile as she looked at her mother's friend. Elia smiled and looked down at her wedding dress. It was a lovely red dress with gold embroidery and sleeveless. Her forearms were covered in golden bracelets and her long black curls were contrasted lovely with several golden hair decorations which Ashura had expertly weaved into her hair, and she was wearing a black clock with the sun and spear of House Martell. Do you think my lord husband will approve? She asked with a grin, mainly to try and cheer Ashura up. She didn't want her best friend to cry before she had even said her vows. It seemed to work as the other woman laughed. He should be lucky that I won't steal you away and marry you myself. She sighed. Oh, I love you. And I you. Elia said as she pulled the other woman into a hug, kissing her long dark hair. Why are we talking like we will never see each other again? I will see you tomorrow and every day after. Because things will be different, you will be a wife. Ashura said as she continued with the hug. You will soon have children of your own to rear and a castle to help run, and soon my father will want me to marry as well. We know that we will not be together forever. No, but we have a long time together still. Elia said before she gently pulled away. Come, I believe it's time, and it won't do to be late for my own wedding. Ashura nodded and fetched them both two thick furs and handed one to Elia before she picked up her daughter, and the three of them left the chamber and made their way to the great hall which a servant had volunteered to bring them to, but Ashura had simply taken down the directions from him and told him that they would find their own way there. It hadn't taken them long. Even if they didn't have the directions, the sounds of hundreds of men and women having a great deal of fun, shouting, arguing, laughing and telling stories both appropriate for a wedding and not would have guided them far better than any handwritten directions could have. They walked into the great hall and the noise suddenly died. Elia had to resist the urge to groan as she noticed that a great deal of the Northmen were staring at her with obvious lust. Despite how uncomfortable it made her, she refused to let it show, and she walked down the space between the great tables, being dimly aware of Ashura following behind her, down to where her new family had just stood to greet her. Despite herself, she felt her breath stop in her throat when she saw her future husband. Earlier, while he had not seemed unattractive by any means, he was certainly nothing to write home about. Now he seemed even more handsome than his older brother. His long brown hair was brushed back and following down to the top of his back. His grey eyes seemed to twinkle in the light of the fire and burned with something that she could not recognize, and his muscular body seemed to be more obvious to her in his wedding outfit, a black leather doublet and breeches with a long dark cape. His plain, stern face seemed to only add to the image of strength, not harm it. She could be married to worse-looking men, she had realized, and now she realized that she was marrying a man that she was actually attracted to, and when his eyes landed on her and they flashed with an emotion that she knew very well, she knew that he was attracted to her. Brandon Stark was still as handsome as ever, but now he had seemed to lose some his previous appeal, despite the fact that he was dressed no differently than his brother, except that he wore no cape. It was all for good, however, as his only seemed to glance at her before they landed on Ashura again. Lyanna Stark was wearing a lovely black dress. Through it had no embroidery. She wore a small simple silver necklace and her hair been done in a simple plait. It worked for the girl, however, and she still looked lovely as ever. Benjen was dressed similarly to his older brothers, except that his doublet was a dark blue instead of black. The boy smiled gently at her. Elia couldn't help but smile back at the boy. She imagined that she and he would grow to be good friends, and it was nice to know that at least one of the Starks liked her. Lord Ricard stood, dressed the same as his two eldest sons, and spoke firmly, holding a goblet in one of his hands which he raised slightly. I am not going to make a toast until after the wedding, but I will say that this is an historic day. Today is the day that House Martell of Dawn and House Stark of the North shall be joined for the rest of time. Now, my lords and ladies, if you will excuse me and my family for one moment as we adjourn to the Godswood so they can say my son and future goddaughter can say their vows. The lords and ladies nodded and quite a few of them cheered. Elia got the feeling that would keep eating and drinking while they were gone. Lord Ricard came up to her with his children following him and gently took Elia's hand. Princess Elia, in the absence of your father or elder brothers, we will need someone to give you away, but I am unsure as to who. Is there someone in your host that will? I shall do it. Ashura spoke and everyone turned to face her, most with looks of shook respect for Lyanna, who had a look of respect on her, and Elia, who had a look of delight on hers. It is usually a man who does it, my lady. Lord Ricard said gently, not wanting to offend. I understand that, but Elia is my sister in all but blood and name. I am the closest thing she has to family here. I shall do it. Ashura said firmly, clearly not going to take no for an answer. Very well. Lord Ricard eventually relented. Elia nodded, more than happy with the way it turned out. She of course would have wanted her brothers to do so, but Doran was not well enough to leave Dawn and was certainly not well enough to come all the way north, and Oberyn had decided not to come as a form of protest, despite that he knew that it wouldn't do any good. Ashura was a more than suitable alternative. The small group, as well as Caitlin and Robert, who as Brandon's and Lyanna's future spouses had the right to attend the service even though it clearly irritated them, not that said future spouses noticed. Ned wanted Robert to be there anyway. He would like all of his siblings to be present for his wedding. Soon left the hall and made there was the stables where they soon mounted their horses. As they ride, Elia felt the eyes of Lord Eddard upon her. He seemed to be impressed with how well she rode. She turned her head to face him and smiled gently. She couldn't help but laugh quietly as her future husband, the grim and serious Eddard Stark, blushed adorably and turned his head to watch where he was riding. It didn't take them long to reach the Godswood, and the group dismounted from their horses and began to walk through the thick thicket of trees. As the group walked through the dark and mysterious woods, Elia noticed that Ashura, Lorien, who of course Ashura had brought with her, Robert and Caitlin all seemed uncomfortable, and as much as Elia hated to admit it, she was feeling quite nervous as well. There was a sense that she did not belong here. The Starks did not seem to feel it. If anything, they walked as if they were simply going to their bedchambers to turn in for the night. They eventually came to a small clearing where a large pale tree with a carved face crying red tears stood tall. The feeling of not being welcome was stronger here, and Elia had to fight the urge to run back to the horses. Ricard and Ned nodded and went to stand by the weirwood tree, and Ashura gently took her friend's arm and led her over to her good father and her soon-to-be husband. Who comes before the old gods this night? Ricard Stark asked, his loud voice ringing through the silence of the dark night. Elia, of the House Martell, comes here to be wed. A woman grown, true-born and noble. She comes to beg the blessing of the gods. Who comes to claim her? Ashura said, and while the words were new to her she spoke them as if she had known them her entire life. Ned stepped forward and spoke softly. Eddard, of the House Stark. Who gives her? Ashura, of the House Dane. Ashura spoke firmly. Princess Elia, do you take this man? Ricard spoke and everyone already knew the answer. I do take this man. Elia said, and Ned stepped forward and gently took her hand. He leaned over to the weirwood and they knelt in front of it, and everyone was silent as the couple prayed to the gods. Elia was technically of the faith of the Seven, but she had never been a very strong believer of the gods in any event, so she simply said her prayers to anyone who would listen. The couple then rose together and Ned took of Elia's cloak and wrapped his own, one with the Stark direwolf sewn onto it, around her shoulders, signifying that she was under his protection. The wedding was over and the two were married, and while there was no real reason or expectation to, man and wife shared a kiss, and for a moment they both saw how this might be a good thing. If they worked at it they could one day, just maybe, be able to love one another. End of Chapter 6. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 7. Fair warning guys, there is quite a bit of smut in this chapter. Underscore 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 underscore. The main hall of Winterfell was alive with laughter and singing. The air was filled with the scent of cooked meat, honeyed chicken and baked pies, both sweet and savory. The feast had been going on for nearly an hour now, and it showed no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Several lords and ladies were now dancing across the great halls, the song The Bear and the Maiden Fair echoing throughout the hall. Elia gently took a sip of the dark ale in her mug and had to try and hide a grimace at the bitter taste. There had been some wine at the feast, but all of it had been very bitter, so she decided to try the ale and found that it was even worse, but she didn't want to send the ale away like she had done with the wine. Dornish wine was different, sweet but with a fire that burned but was somehow not unpleasant. Perhaps when she visited Dorne she would bring a few bottles back with her. She was sitting in between her lord husband and Ashura, who was drinking the same ale as her in a show of solidarity, and she was handling it far better than Elia was managing to. Eddard was on his second mug of the foul stuff and he was drinking it as easily as water. He turned his head and, having felt his lady wife's eyes on him, and put down the mug. "Are you enjoying yourself, my lady?" he asked with a smile. "Yes, my lord, but I would if I could trouble you for a dance. I am fairly certain it is common for the bride and the groom to dance at their own wedding," Elia said lightly and with a teasing grin. Eddard blushed slightly and looked down at his feet for a moment. "I am afraid I am not very good at dancing, my lady," he admitted, and further down the table Brandon, who was sitting in between his father and his betrothed, laughed. "Oh, go on, Ned. It isn't very kind to deny your wife a dance," and the rest of us could do with a laugh. Ned frowned at his brother's teasing before he gently took Elia's hand and led her out to the dance floor. "I apologize in advance if I happen to stand on your toes, my lady," he whispered in her ear as he warped his arms around her and he began to gently lead her. The musicians noticed that one of their lords and his wife had taken to the floor and changed the song. It was a slow one that spoke of a long and healthy life filled with as many children as they could ever want and love to last them for the rest of their days. Elia did not recognize it, but she found that she liked it a great deal. The new couple danced around and through other couples on the dance floor. Despite his warning, Ned did not once step on Elia's toes. She wondered if he realized how truly graceful he was on his feet. It did surprise her that such a man could be so graceful. Oberyn was graceful as were most other Dornish men, but they were leanly muscled while her husband was muscled firmly. As they danced she could not help but rest her hands on his chest and feel said muscle that rested underneath. Her husband looked down at her and something dark flashed in his eyes. Elia shivered, but not from fear or cold. "I do hope that you do not think I am being too forward, Eddard." "Please, my lady, call me Ned," Ned whispered gruffly, and Elia couldn't help but shiver again. Who knew that a cold barbarian from a frozen waste could make her feel so warm? "Only if you call me Elia, Ned," Elia whispered as she tilted her head to look up at him. "You are my husband, you have more than the right to call me by my first name." Ned hummed and carried on leading her through the dance. Robert led an annoyed-looking Lyanna onto the floor, but as usual he did not seem to notice, or if he did then he didn't care. that his future betrothed barely looked like she could stand him. Brandon was also leading Caitlin Stark onto the floor as well, and he at least did not look like he was being marched to the headman's block unlike his sister. Ashura, it seemed, had not wanted to be left out, so she had taken Benjen's hand and lead him out as well, the two of them laughing at something that Elia wasn't sure about. Lauren was sitting in the lap of Lord Ricard. That surprised Elia, as Ashura wasn't normally comfortable leaving her daughter alone with strangers, but Lord Ricard gave off a sense of trustworthiness that made it clear that the child was in no danger from him. Plus, the old lord's face had a small smile on his face as he looked down at the small girl who was sitting on his lap and babbling happily, and Elia wondered how long it had been since he had a small child to adore without having to worry about making matches and forging alliances with other houses by using them as bargaining chips. All too soon Elia felt a rush of pity for the man. Brandon and Lyanna, while she had no right to judge, were clearly not the easiest children to raise, and she realized that he was probably thinking of better times. Elia quickly took in a deep breath. It wouldn't do to appear sad at her own wedding, so she turned her attention back to her husband and all the people around them. "I am afraid that I know very little about northern houses, Ned. I may need you to help educate me in this regard," Elia said as they spun around, her dark eyes scanning the other 30 or so people who were also on their feet. "Of course, Elia, but not tonight if you do not mind. I have other things on mind than reciting off names and histories," he said with a smirk, and Elia could not help but chuckle softly. "Of course, and you are lucky, my lord, that you are not alone in that," Elia said as they stepped away from one another and then brought themselves back to Gotha. She could feel other lords and ladies' eyes on them, most of them noticing that their lord's son seemed to be quite taken with his new wife and that his new wife seemed to feel the same. She noticed out of the corner of her eye that a tall slim man with a grim face was watching her intensely, and he was speaking softly to the man sitting next to him, a very fat young man with curly blonde hair and cold blue eyes who was staring at Elia with a look that could only be described as utter contempt. "Those two are watching us, more specifically me, and not in the way most men watch me," Elia whispered to Ned. "Who is?" he asked with a concerned look on his face. "The two men to the left of us. Do not look up as they will notice, simply glance and look back." Ned did as he was instructed, glancing over before looking back at his wife with a dark expression on his face. Roose Bolton, the Lord of House Bolton and the Dreadfort, and his bannerman Lud Whitehill, the recent new Lord of House Whitehill. Ned sighed and shook his head. "I would not have them here. They are not the most pleasant of company at the best of times, but it would do no good to exclude them, considering they are both fairly angry with my father as it is." "And why is that?" Elia asked, even though she was fairly certain that she already knew the answer, given how they were glaring at her. "They were not happy with him for having his children marry outside of the north. Brandon is marry Cataltin and Lyanna to marry Brandon, and I am married to you, a princess of Dawn. That is as far south as you can get," Ned said with a shake of his head. "They are both unhappy with that, Lord Whitehill especially, as he has two younger sisters that he would have liked to see me and Brandon married to." Elia bit her lip. She had only been in the north for less than a day, and she had already made two powerful enemies by simply arriving and saying her vows. Suddenly all the music stopped. Brandon had made his way back to the dais with Caitlin hanging off his arms, a red flush painting her face, making her look even more lovely, and he was holding his goblet. "I think it's time for the bedding," he shouted, and soon the hall was filled with shouting and cheering. "Bedding! Bedding! Bedding!" The cheers grew louder and louder, and Ned looked as if he was about to say something, perhaps to indicate that he didn't want there to be a wedding, but he stopped when he felt Elia's hand on his arm, and he looked back to see her shake her head. This was something that every bride and groom had to go through, from Dawn to the north, and she would be no different. Lord Ricard looked a tad upset that his son and heir had stopped the feast instead of him, but he simply sighed and nodded. "Let us bed them." Suddenly a whole host of northern men, and Robert Baratheon and men from the Dornish host rushed over to her, picked her up and began to carry her out of the room. Behind her she could hear ladies shriek and giggle. She identified at least two of the voices belonging to Ashura and Lady Lysa, as they attacked her husband and began to push him out of the room. While it was certainly not something she would choose as a first choice, she had to admit that it wasn't quite as bad as she thought it was going to be. The men may have ripped her dress, but with her they were gentle. The jokes were often filthy and crude, but it was clear by their tones that they were simply jokes, and when one of the men perhaps got a bit comfortable or began to take liberties, her countryman, and to her surprise Robert Baratheon, stopped it from going further. Eventually they arrived at her husband's bedchambers. Two of the men opened the door as the others gently let her down and Robert gently pushed her through the door before closing it behind her. If there was one thing that she was upset about, it was that her wedding dress was in tatters. The bottom part of the gown was completely ripped away, leaving nothing but her bare legs. The corset had survived better, but that wasn't saying much as it was still tattered and ripped and her breasts were on full display. The chamber door opened and Ned was shoved in. He was in a better state than his wife as his breeches were intact, but his doublet and his undershirt were gone, leaving only his bare chest. As the door slammed shut behind him, his eyes widened as he stared at the sight that was Elia. "My lady," he breathed. Elia shushed him and stepped closer, resting her hands on his bare chest. "I told you to call me Elia, Ned," she whispered huskily before she pressed her lips to his. For a moment they just stood there, kissing and enjoying one another. They did not love one another yet, but they were both married to someone they found very attractive, and that made the burden of their duty far lighter. "Are you two going to get on with it?" Brandon shouted from outside of the door. "You can't make me an uncle or father, a grandfather, by just talking. If you want Ned, I can come in and take over. I'm sure none would be able to tell the difference," Robert shouted with a laugh. Ned growled and gently led Elia over to the bed. He pushed her down onto it gently and climbed on top of her. He pressed their lips together for a moment before he began to kiss down her neck, her chest and her stomach before finally arriving in between his lady wife's thighs. He pressed a gentle kiss to one of them before he turned his attention to her wet entrance. He wasn't sure why, but somehow the way her pink cunt looked against her brown skin seemed to him one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He leaned in and began to gently lap at the outside of it. Elia whined and clutched the feather pillow beneath her tightly. She was from Dawn, and this was not the first time that someone had granted her a lord's kiss, but the sensation was always so intense that she had never really gotten used to it. "Ned," she whined. Ned did not let up, continuing to lap on the outside of her lips for a while before he began to push his tongue into her, looking into her eyes and enjoying every moan and gasp and half prayer and whimper that he brought out of her. Ned licked and sucked and nipped, and soon Elia shook and screamed and Ned's face was drenched. As Elia panted to try and get her breath back, Ned pulled away and undid his breeches before pulling them down. He then sat down on the bed and waited for Elia to calm down. Elia breathed in deep before sitting up and reaching for Ned's cock, which she began to stroke. Ned closed his eyes and swallowed. "My lady, you do not have to." "But I wish to," was all Elia said before she took him into her mouth. This was something she had experience with, and many a man, and woman, had been driven out of their minds for a time after she was done with them. But be that as it may, she didn't want to ruin her husband all at once, so she would need to hold back a little bit. She licked and sucked all around his shaft and head, humming to cause pleasant vibrations, and she wasn't surprised to feel him spilling down her throat soon after. She pulled away and smiled up at him, and the smile was returned, though it was tired and broken by panting every second. It was time. Ned placed himself in between Elia's thighs and slowly slid into her. He waited for her to tell him that she was ready before he began to thrust back and forth. The tight, wet heat that surrounded him was quite possibly the finest thing that the gods had ever created. Elia whimpered and tightened around Ned. He was far bigger than any man she had taken before, and while there was pain, a part of her loved it. They were both still sensitive, and it only took a few thrusts before they reached completion. They both laid on the bed and panted. Both exhausted, an exhaustion they could feel in their bones but was in an odd way satisfying. Outside they could hear men cheering. And as Elia laid there with her arms around her new husband and they slowly began to drift off to sleep, she thought that perhaps she would grow to like it here indeed. End of Chapter 7. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 8. Elia blinked her eyes open when she felt the warm sun landing on her skin. She was surprised by how warm it actually felt in the room, given how cold it was outside of the castle, but the large fur covers provided more than enough protection against the cold. The morning sun was warm enough, if not quite as warm as she was used to, and the man who shared her bed gave off more than enough heat on his own. Ned's stern face had relaxed in sleep, and Elia took another moment to realize how truly handsome he actually was. She wondered if all those who said he was plain or that his brother was more handsome by far would feel the same if they could see him like this, or when he was locked in passion. He was breathing steadily at first, but he seemed to have sensed the movement in the bed, all that warrior's training no doubt, as he opened his eyes slowly and sat up in bed and smiled at her bashfully. "Good morning, my lady," did you sleep well? His voice was rough with sleep and it somehow just made him even more attractive to her. I think that I can safely say that it has been a very long time since I have had such a satisfying rest. Elia said with a grin that only grew wider as her husband blushed a deep red. Who knew that the fierce, cold barbarian could not only blush but would look adorable doing so? I hope that I did not hurt you, my lady. Ned said quietly. He had enjoyed last night a great deal, but looking back on it he realized that he may have been a little too rough. His beautiful wife was a fragile-looking thing, like a statue made of marble that would break into 1,000 pieces if it fell onto the floor. You did not, Ned, and I told you can call me Elia. I am far stronger than I look, I can assure you. Elia leaned in and pressed a kiss to his lips, smiling inwardly as she felt him kiss her back. They stayed there for a while, simply enjoying one another before there was a quick knock at the door. Elia. Lord Eddard. Might I come in? Ashura asked from the other side of the door. Ned and Elia pulled apart and Elia couldn't help but sigh in disappointment. Yes, Ashura, come in. She called as Ned used some of the blanket to cover himself with as Ashura walked in, a folded up dress in her hands. Lord Ricard has asked that you both come down to breakfast. I said that I would fetch you both. Ashura said, keeping her eyes firmly on Elia. Yes, of course. Pardon me, Lady Ashura. Ned said bashfully as he stood out of bed and quickly grabbed some clothes from a chest and threw them on. Ashura risked a glance and saw his muscled back before she turned her head back to her friend and smiled in approval. Once Ned was fully dressed he turned to face his wife and her lady-in-waiting. I shall see you both at breakfast, Lady Ashura, my La Elia. He caught himself and smiled when he saw Elia smiled and then left the room, closing the door after he left. Well, certainly not bad to look at. Ashura said with a grin before she turned to look at her best friend. So, how was it? How was he? Is he wielding a dagger or a great sword? Ashura. Elia shouted, trying to sound offended, but she couldn't keep the smile off her face or stop herself from laughing. You are utterly terrible, even by my standards. You still haven't answered my question and I am not dressing you until you do. Ashura said with a smirk as she held the folded up dress close to her chest, as if she was holding it hostage. Elia sighed and shook her head. He was fine, I enjoyed it a very great deal and, everything is well in proportion to everything else. May I please get dressed now? Of course. Ashura said as Elia got out of bed. She unfolded the dress out onto the bed. It was a more subtle affair compared to her wedding dress. It was a pale yellow with billowing sleeves and green embroidery around the sleeves and the bottom of its skirt. As Ashura helped her to put it on she spoke. So, what are the sleeping arrangements going to be? Will you be sleeping with your lord husband every night? Because I must say that I did not hate how roomy our chamber was when it was just me and Lauren in there. Elia shook her head and rolled her eyes. I think that, most likely, I will be sleeping in my husband's chambers most nights. So, yes, you basically have that chamber all to yourself. Ashura could not hide her grin, nor did she try to. This breakfast should be interesting. I know that Lord Robert and Lady Caitlin, as well as Lady Lysa, have been invited to attend it, and considering Lord Robert's reputation and knowing Lord Brandon, I think you should be prepared for a few tasteless jokes. I am more than prepared. Elia said as Ashura finished dressing her. Elia sat on the bed and Ashura climbed on behind her and began to style her hair. As Ashura ran her fingers through Elia's hair, something came to Elia. She knew that it wasn't any of her business, but she had to know. Ashura, how do you know Lord Brandon exactly? Ashura's fingers stilled for a moment before they resumed moving through her hair. I've seen him at various tourneys and feasts and we have spoken once or twice. Why, Elia? She asked as she picked up a dozen or so strands of hair and began to twist them together. Elia closed her eyes and sighed. She had to ask. Is there something I should know about you and Lord Brandon, and Lauren? For a moment Ashura was silent and Elia was worried that she had offended her, but then she felt something wet dripping down onto the top of her head. She turned her head to look over her shoulder and saw that Ashura had tears running down her face and her shoulders were shaking widely. Elia turned around and gently pulled her friend into a hug. As soon as Ashura was in her arms she broke down sobbing. She rubbed her back and gently hushed her to try and calm her down. She knew the truth now and her heart broke for her friend. How it must hurt to watch the man you loved marrying someone else. Even now it still hurt to think of Roriga marrying someone else, and Ashura had it even worse. being forced to watch as the man she loved had to spend time with his soon-to-be wife. All thoughts of the breakfast left her head, for now all that mattered was that her friend was upset. Underscore 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 underscore. Lionel was incredibly bored and hungry as well. Her father made it clear that could not eat until her brother's new wife and her friend arrived at the table. She wouldn't mind too much if the food wasn't already on the table. Just a few inches away from her. Bacon burnt black. Freshly baked bread straight from the oven that it was still hot to the touch. Fresh beans and baked fish that had been caught just this morning and tender sausages and eggs that had the yolks still runny and dark ale and oatcakes, and suddenly her dislike of her good sister grew even more. The others at the table didn't seem to care or even notice that she was hungry and fidgeting. Even Benjamin, who was younger than her, was sitting still, but that was probably because he was in direct view of their father while she was sitting next to Robert, which was not helping her mood at all. Ned had just turned up and he seemed happy enough. From the moment he sat down, Brandon and Robert began to grill them for details about the night before, and Lady Caitlin and Lady Lysa both blushed at every dirty word like the perfect little southern ladies that they were. It was pathetic. Ned thankfully spared her from having to hear anything by simply ignoring his brother and best friend's questions, and he simply asked Lady Caitlin and Lady Lysa if they were enjoying Winterfell. At that moment Elia and Ashura walked in and Lyanna realized that she had probably kept them waiting on purpose. She was a princess after all and technically outranked them all. What better way to make sure they remembered that by keeping them waiting? "Pardon us for being late, we couldn't get this dress tied up no matter how much we tried," Elia said as she sat down at the table next to Ned and Ashura sat down next to her. Lyanna was the first to put food on her plate as soon as they sat down. She was certain that she could feel her father's eyes staring into her with disapproval, but at the moment she was too hungry to care. Everyone else began to pile up their plates and soon they were tucking in. "Tell me, princess. Have you written to your brother to tell him that you have arrived?" Ricard asked as he looked at his new goddaughter. "I did, good father. I wrote a letter to my eldest brother and sent it via a rider. He was specifically attached to my host to send back word that I've arrived, but I imagine that it will be a while until the letter arrives," Elia said as she quickly and cleanly cut through a sausage with her knife. Ricard nodded before turning to his eldest son. "Earlier this morning I received a letter from Host Tully. Lady Lysa, you are to return to Riverrun. However, Lady Caitlin, your father wishes for you to stay here for a few moons." "Why?" Brandon asked. "Not that I am complaining, of course, my lady," he said quickly to Caitlin before she reached the obvious conclusion. "Because he believes, and I am inclined to agree with him, that it would be better for the two of you to get to know one another before you actually marry one another," Ricard said firmly. "Now, if you will all excuse me," he said before he stood up from the table and left the hall, his breakfast left half finished on his plate. Lyanna stood up from her plate and grabbed her last rasher of bacon. "I am going to go riding," she said as she popped the bacon into her mouth and began to walk away from the table. "Perhaps I could join you, Lyak," Robert said happily as he stood up from the table, and Lyanna had to resist sighing in annoyance. She knew that it wasn't really fair, but she had heard all of the stories about Robert Baratheon and all of his bastards, and she was not interested in marrying anyone anyway, least of all him. "Forgive me, Lord Robert, but I prefer to ride on my own, please excuse me." Lyanna quickly left the room before Robert could say anything. Robert looked more surprised by how quickly Lyanna left than by anything else. Ned once again couldn't help but feel sorry for his friend, but even so he couldn't blame his sister too harshly. She was just afraid that Robert would continue his hoeing ways, even though Ned knew that he wouldn't once he married Lyanna. "Ned, why don't we go and spar for a bit?" Robert shouted and clapped his friend on the back harshly, so hard in fact that the bit of bacon that was in his mouth went flying across the hall, causing Brandon and Benjen to laugh. Ned wiped at his mouth and then nodded before standing up. He could do with a good fight. He was good at fighting, better than politics and ruling. Fighting was simpler and easier, everything was obvious. You know what you had to do to keep on top of it, and you didn't have to worry about watching what you say or worry about offending some random lord. "Would you and Lady Dane like to come and watch Elia?" Ned asked, knowing it was the polite thing to do and that Dornish women often had more interest in combat than even northern women. "I would, Ned, but I think I shall refuse this time. I started some needlework in the wheelhouse that I would quite like to get finished. Elia explained and Ned nodded. I think I'll come with you, Brandon said as he stood up. He turned his head to look at Caitlin. Another time, my lady, he said with his charming smile before he followed his younger brother and his friend out of the room. Benjen stood up from his chair. Can I come with you? He shouted excitedly. No, Benjen, you have your lessons with the maester and you don't want father yelling at you because you missed them, do you? Brandon called over his shoulder and Benjen sighed before leaving the room to go to his lessons. Cat, would you mind helping me with packing? Clearly I'm not going to get to stay as long as I would have liked, Lysa said with a sigh as she stood up. Caitlin nodded and the two sisters left the room. In a matter of moments the two Dornish women were alone. Ashura raised an eyebrow. I get the feeling, my dear friend, that living here is going to make us appreciate our families back home a lot more. Elia sighed heavily and shook her head as she realized how right her friend probably was. End of Chapter 8. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 9. Casterly Rock was resplendent in the warm sunlight. Every single feature was in plain view and the only word that could be used to describe was it grand. It had existed for hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years, and the family that lived there now would make sure that it continued to endure. It was carved out of the same stone of the mountain that it was set in, and all over the mountain there were mine shafts that burrowed deep under the skin of the mountain, like worms under rotting flesh scurrying look for more food. There was always noise coming from the shafts. Even at the very darkest of night there was always noise. It might drive a lesser man insane. Tyrion Lannister was many things, but weak he was not. No matter what his father and dear older sister thought of him. His room was in a large tower which overlooked the largest, and most busy, of the mine shafts, meaning that all hours of the day he heard the sound of heavy mine machinery and men breaking their backs to get gold out of the mine. He did have to laugh at his father's sense of humor. He was a twisted little monster, as his father so often liked to remind him, and he had him looked into a tower. He imagined that if he was someone else then he would find it absolutely hilarious. He wondered what others thought of him. He had very rarely been able to leave Casterly Rock. The farthest he had ever been was the outskirts of Lannisport, and that was only when he was with his brother or one of his uncles. He knew of the stories that were passed around since he had been born and his mother had died giving birth to him. He had heard it said that according to one story he had a head that was as large as a pumpkin, that his teeth were as long as dagger blades and he couldn't close his mouth because of them. He also heard that he had 2 black eyes and lion's claws and a tail, and even one time he was told that a story said he had a pair of scaly black wings. Almost like a dragon. He wished that he had wings, then he could fly as far away as he wanted and there would be no one to tell him what to do and what not to do. No one would miss him anyway, except maybe for Jaime. He sighed and looked down at the book he was reading. It told of the rise to power of House Tyrell. It was quite impressive to say the least. They acted as the trusted and loyal servants, and as soon as they had the opportunity they seized it, and now they were the ones in control of the Reach. It was like the opposite version of his father's conflict with the Rains, except the Tyrells were smart enough not to take the fight to them. He shut the book. He wasn't interested really, but there was little else he could do but read, so most of his time was spent reading, so he had to at least pretend to be interested to stop himself from going mad, and this was one of the few books he hadn't read yet. Maybe he should go and get one of his favorites from the library, perhaps the one about Aegon's conquest. That one at least mentioned the dragons more than the book in front of him did. Just as he was about to get up and leave the room, the door opened and Jaime walked in. Jaime was everything that their father had wanted in a son, tall and golden and muscular and charming and so beautiful it hurt to look at him sometimes. Jaime had always been his champion ever since Tyrion was born. He protected him and loved him when no one else would, and had always made time for him, despite the fact it was the one thing their sister hated about him. He had always loved him for that, but at the same time it was impossible for Tyrion not to hate him as well. He was perfect Jaime and he was Tyrion, the imp. "Hello little brother," Jaime said with a warm smile as he walked over to where Tyrion was sitting and ruffled his hair, and Tyrion ducked his head and smiled. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant a great deal to him. Very few people even wanted to be near him, let alone touch, and the few times he was touched it was from boys who were similar in age to him who wanted to punish him for being different. "Hello Jaime, how goes your training?" Tyrion asked with a sheepish smile. He would have gone to watch it, but his father had forbidden him for some reason. Have you read the book I told you about? Not yet, I will get to it through, I promise. Jaime promised, and Tyrion knew he would. Jaime had never lied to him and he would never break a promise. Anyway, Father wants us both to come down to breakfast. Father actually wants me. Are you certain it's him? Perhaps a Grumpkin snuck past the guards and replaced him in the night as we slept. Tyrion smirked, and he don't think he ever felt more proud of himself than when Jaime laughed. I am certain that it's him. Now, come on. Father will throw us both down a mine shaft if we keep him waiting. Jaime said as he stood up and walked out of the room, Tyrion following after him. You want to race? I bet you'll beat me. You mean that you'll let me run ahead and use the shortcuts so you can let me win so I don't feel as bad? I love you, brother, but you are a terrible liar. Tyrion thought to himself, but he didn't say anything. He didn't say anything, however, because he knew that his brother meant well and was only trying to help. No, I think I would just rather walk down if it's all the same to you, brother. Tyrion said, and Jaime nodded, and then the two brothers began to walk down the steps of the tower. Neither of them said anything, but they didn't need to. It was a comfortable silence. Eventually they made it to the small chamber where the Lannister family often broke their fast. It was a small room, but it was cozy, and there was a large table in the middle of it that took up half of the room. His father was sitting at the head of it, his eyes scanning a letter in his hands quite intently. He looked up when he saw them walk in, but his eyes only watched them both for a moment before he went back to reading the letter. Cersei was sitting at their father's left, looking beautiful as always with her long golden hair and bright green eyes, and dressed in a beautiful red dress. Her eyes light up when she saw Jaime and then darkened when they landed on Tyrion. An expression of disgust darkened her lovely face, like she had seen a revolting beetle or a large slug crawl into the room. She turned her head away very quickly. Jaime and Tyrion quickly sat down. As soon as they did, their father spoke up. It seems that the Princess Elia has gone north to marry Lord Stark's second son Eddard. A large smile threatened to split Cersei's face. Father, truly? She breathed, and despite how impossible it seemed, her smile seemed to grow wider at her father's nod. Good. That foreign whore was no match for Rhaegar, and slowly freezing to death with a barbarian for a husband is no less than she deserves. Tywin glanced at his daughter but said nothing about her language of the Dornish princess. In a few moons you will go to court, Cersei. You will need to adjust to the court, as it will be your home for a very long time, perhaps the rest of your life. Of course, father. Cersei said sweetly, always willing to act the dutiful daughter if it suited her. Jaime, you shall go with her and try and find a woman that you think shall be a suitable match. If I find that she is suitable enough for you, then I shall contact their family and arrange a match. Tywin ordered. Yes, father. Jaime said with a sigh. He knew that it was pointless for him to even try and argue with his father, and every time he had tried it always ended painfully. Good. Tywin said with a nod, clearly pleased at his son and daughter's obedience before he continued. I shall. Father. Tyrion interrupted, and for the first time in his life Jaime felt truly scared for his brother's safety. No one in their right mind would dare interrupt Tywin Lannister when he was speaking if they planned on keeping their head, but his brother showed no fear. Might I ask something? Tywin's face was unreadable. It was impossible to tell if he was annoyed or furious at the interruption, or if even felt anything about at all. He simply stared at his youngest son for a moment before he nodded. You may. He said clearly. May I go to King's Landing, father? I've always wanted to see the capital. Tyrion asked hopefully. Cersei looked alarmed and glanced at her father with a horrified look in her eyes, but she needn't have worried as her father agreed with her. No, you may not. I will not have you embarrassing either your brother or your sister or the rest of our family. Your existence is enough of a stain on our name as it is, and I will not have you making it worse. Do you understand? Tyrion closed his eyes and tightened his fists. He willed himself not to cry. He would not give either his father or his sister any satisfaction, and simply breathed through his teeth. Of course, father. I understand completely. But what am I to do while Jaime and my sweet sister are gone? I shall find something suitable for you to entertain yourself with, do not worry for that. Tywin said as he glanced away from his youngest child and picked up another letter. Have you any more questions? No, father, might I be excused? Tyrion said quietly. At his father's nod he jumped out of his chair and hurried towards the door, trying to ignore the feeling of his sister's smug stare burning into his back. How he hated her. As he left the room he could hear his father telling Jaime to stay in his seat, that there was still business that they had to discuss, and once again Tyrion's heart swelled with love for his brother. Always his champion no matter what, truly the only one deserving of anything good in this wretched house. He ran all the way back to his room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. He went over to his bed and laid down on it as he thought once again how wonderful it would be to have wings. To soar higher and higher and have no one to stop him. Soon he would be a man grown and he would leave. His father wouldn't be able to keep him here forever, and one day he would return with a beautiful wife who loved him for him and lovely children, and his father and sister would realize that they had been wrong about him. Yes. One day. End of chapter 9. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 10. Doran Martell sighed happily as he watched his two children gasp and squeal delightedly as they ran through the water gardens. They had both been with their mother in Sunspear for the past month and he had missed them both greatly. They and their mother had come to see Elia and Ashura off. Tristan hadn't even been walking by the last time he had seen him, and now the boy was running around like it was second nature. Arianne had grown as well, already looking like a proper little lady, which was her mother's influence more than anything. Melorio had since returned to Sunspear. They had been having difficulties lately, but it wouldn't do for the people of Dawn to know that their prince and princess could barely stand one another, so they had both arranged for them to spend as little time as possible together. When one of them was in Sunspear, the other would be in the water gardens. His wife had never liked Dawn. Compared to Norphos it seemed to be an entirely different world. His ears still rung from the argument he had with her when he told her that he was going to have Arianne trained to defend herself. He had allowed her to have her way that one time, but he would only bend so far with her. Arianne would rule after him and she had to be ready. He sometimes wondered how it had reached this point. He had loved Melorio a great deal once. He still loved her very much, but somehow along the way the love had faded. He was sick and tired in a way that had nothing to do with his sickness. He still remembered the day he had met Melorio. He had never been much of a traveler, as being heir had meant that he had always been more focused on his responsibilities to his country and to his family above all else, but his mother insisted that he tried to have some enjoyment while he was still young, so he had decided to tour the free cities. When he had come to Norphos, Melorio's father had wanted to brag that he had a foreign prince for dinner, and so he had invited him to stay while he was in Norphos. He had met Melorio at dinner that night and she had stolen his breath away at first sight. He didn't think he had ever seen a more beautiful woman in his entire life, and her beauty wasn't only on the surface. She was kind and generous and as smart as some of the wisest maesters. He hadn't wanted to leave her, so he had sent his mother a letter that said that he would be extending his travels by another month. His mother hadn't had a problem with it, as she wanted him to have a little fun before he was overwhelmed by his duties after all. But then he had sent another letter saying he was extending travels, and then another and another and then another. He imagined that if he sent a few more like that, then his mother would have assumed that he had been taken hostage and she would soon have half their standing forces after him, and he truly did not want a war starting over him, so he sent a final letter to his mother informing her that he was returning to Dawn. And he would be bringing Melorio back as his wife. His mother had been disappointed in his choice, and that was something of an understatement. She had hoped to marry him to a Targaryen if he remembered correctly. She came around to the idea eventually, and he liked to hope that eventually she had grown fond of her, though he realized that it was most likely wishful thinking on his part. But they had been young. He had fallen in love with a beautiful woman and Mel had fallen for a handsome prince from a far-off land. It wasn't enough to build a strong relationship on, and now they could barely stand to be in the same room as one another when their children weren't with them. The hardest thing was that he didn't hate her. It would be so much easier if he did, but he didn't. He loved her. But love wasn't always enough. He wondered what his mother would think now. Mostly likely she would tut and call him a foolish boy and set to fixing all of his mistakes while assuring him that everything would be alright. He missed her a great deal. She had only been gone for 2 years and he was still new to this, and he knew that some of the lords didn't trust his judgment. Their beloved and wise princess had been replaced by a young and sick boy who didn't know what he was doing, who wasn't ready. If his mother was still here, then she would never have stood for Elia being set aside by Aerys. She had fought so hard for the match after all. She would have made him regret it, but not with swords and flame, but with words that would bring House Targaryen crashing down around the Mad King. Well, he may not be as smart as his mother, but by sending Elia north they had a new ally in House Stark. Rickard Stark was ambitious but not particularly subtle. It didn't take much time for him to figure out what he was doing by betrothing his oldest son and his only daughter to houses not of the north. By sending Elia to marry his second son, it was a way of declaring that he would support Rickard. And House Targaryen would be reduced to rubble. If the Mad King found out, then they would be all burned to ashes, but it was worth the risk. The man was growing worse and it wouldn't be long until he tried to burn them all anyway. Still, he had cautioned Lord Rickard and asked him to be patient. They had to wait for the exact right moment before they strike. He was brought out of his thoughts by a knock at his door. He nodded his head to Ario, who opened the door. He still was so surprised that the large man was so loyal to him, considering that he had come from Norphos with his wife and had been in her service to her family. Standing outside the door was a young servant boy holding a letter. "A letter for you has just arrived, my prince." Doran stood and tried to ignore the pain in them, but it was hard. What had started as a dull ache was now a stabbing pain that threatened to knock him to the floor. He walked over to the boy and took the letter. "Thank you, you may go now." The boy nodded respectfully and ran off. Doran sat back down and scanned the letter. It was from Elia. He looked up at Ario. "Ario, would please go and fetch my brother. Tell him that he must come now." Ario nodded and obediently followed out his prince's orders, leaving the room as Doran continued to read the letter. Before long Ario returned with Oberyn, clearly annoyed at being summoned when he had hoped to be spending time with his children. "What's wrong, Doran?" Doran handed over the letter to his brother. "Read it, it's from Elia." As soon as he said that, all the annoyance had fled from Oberyn's face and he began to read the letter. "She writes that she is well and the wedding has already taken place. She already seems quite fond of her new husband." Doran said with a smile. "I do believe they shall be fine. Elia would try not to worry us, you know how she is." Oberyn said, looking the letter over to see if he could find any hidden pleas for help. "How do we know she is fine?" "We don't, but I trust Elia, and if she says that she is fine, then she is fine." Doran said as he watched his brother with amusement. Clearly his overprotectiveness was still a present feature. "Elia will be fine, I promise you." "I hope you are right," Oberyn said as he handed the letter back. "Because if you are wrong, if we get a letter that says that Elia is in danger or unhappy, then I will ride north with loyal men and get her back." He then stood up and left the room, and Doran knew it was probably better to let him go. He loved Elia almost more than anything, so of course he would most likely try and do that, but if he tried, Doran would of course stop him. Elia would be fine, of that he had no doubt. But he couldn't have Oberyn risking this alliance. As much as it was a hard truth to realize, some things were just more important than family. End of Chapter 10. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 11. Rhaegar sighed heavily as he rubbed at his eyes to try and banish the sleep from them. He had not been sleeping well lately due to his father's continuing instability. The man seemed to grow more and more paranoid with each passing day, and he constantly felt as if he was being watched, which he most likely was. He glanced down at the letter on his desk. It had come from Casterly Rock with another letter. The first letter was for his father, informing him that Cersei Lannister was on her way to the capital with her brother joining her. They would be married in a matter of weeks, and Rhaegar was not looking forward to it. Cersei Lannister was no doubt a beautiful woman. A blind man with half his wits would be able to tell that, but the woman did not seem particularly intelligent. She was by no means stupid, and he was judging her by only a few scant interactions, but considering how smart Tywin Lannister was and how smart Johanna Lannister had been, he had been expecting more from their progeny. Again, it was an unfair judgment considering he barely knew the woman, but he needed a wife who was his equal in intelligence. He was playing a dangerous game and he needed a partner in that. Someone who he could ask for their opinion, and he knew he would be receiving sound advice from them. In reality, he knew that he needed Elia. Elia had been his friend long before she was ever going to be his wife, and he had always trusted her opinion, and when his father had informed him that he would be marrying the Dornish princess, he had been silently praising his good fortunes. Having Elia as his wife practically assured House Martell and all of Dorne's loyalty, and he would Elia's intelligence on hand. And then in the span of a breath his father seemed to decided that Dorne was no longer trustworthy and that Elia was no longer good enough for his firstborn, and the contract was broken. Now Elia was married to Eddard Stark and she was further away than ever. Rhaegar hadn't been in love with Elia. He had valued her as a friend and a confidant and respected her intelligence, but he had not loved her. Would that be the difference with Cersei Lannister? Would he love her but be starved of intelligence and friendship? Was love worth the lack of all else? He still wasn't sure why his father had chosen to wed him to Cersei. He had been ranting and raving for months about how much he hated Tywin, how the upstart would dare to think that he would marry his son to a servant's daughter, and how he had stolen Johanna from him, and Rhaegar didn't want to think about what that meant. And then one day he had summoned Tywin to court and arranged to have Cersei married to him. It was the sanest Rhaegar had seen his father in a very, very long time. He had hoped that it was the start of his father recovering, but even then he knew that had been a naive hope. His paranoia was as strong as ever, and he had most likely agreed to the match so that he would Tywin's only daughter as a hostage to ward Tywin off from trying anything. Rhaegar sighed and shook his head to try and clear his mind of these thoughts. He had more important things to worry about at the moment. The second letter was for him and had been delivered straight into his hand when his father hadn't been looking by Lord Tywin's rider. If he was reading it correctly, all the letters had been written in code. Then it was Lord Tywin assuring him of his loyalty and that he would stand by him, and that he saw his marriage to his only daughter as cementing their alliance. Rhaegar was grateful for the reassurance and decided that when he saw Tywin Lannister again he would need to thank him in person. His loyalty was too valuable to risk. Tywin was his closest ally, and if pushed then his armies could be here within a week, and he needed them for when he would take the throne from his father. At that moment the door to his study opened and Jon Connington stepped in. The man was tall and white, and his red hair was matched by his red face. He knew that many people mocked Jon for his appearance, even despite the fact he was Hand of the King. The man still seemed uncomfortable in his new role, but Rhaegar knew that he would suffer it for him. "My prince," Jon said respectfully, nodding his head. "I hate to intrude, but your father has sent me with a message for you. He intends to dine with you and your mother and brother tonight. He would like you to inform them of this arrangement." His tone informed him of everything Jon's words did not. "I'm sorry, Rhaegar, you know how is." Rhaegar nodded and sighed at these silent words before he stood. "Thank you, Jon, I will see to it now." He left the room quickly, his hope for a quiet supper with his mother and little brother ruined. He had promised his mother that he would try and eat with her and Viserys tonight, and he had been looking forward to it all day. More than that, are you running from something else? A little voice inside his head whispered, and Rhaegar frowned heavily, picking up his pace. He was well aware of Jon's feelings for him. He spent a lot of time with Jon, and he was hardly the most subtle man, and it didn't take him long to figure it out. He supposed that some men would be disgusted, would probably have Jon banished from their sight if not have him executed. He supposed that others, who were kinder, would have gently let the man down. Rhaegar, once he had figured it out, had done neither. He told himself that if Jon had ever confessed to him then he would let him, but recently he wasn't sure. He had always been able to practice the female form and even lust after it. He had desired Elia and did not imagine that he would have any difficulty conceiving a child with Cersei, but he had certainly not been blind to the fact that his friend was an extremely handsome man. His strong arms, pale skin that burned even more easily than his own, his stern eyes that only seemed to soften for him. A strong, muscular back and thick legs, and his thick red beard which always looked like it would scratch in his skin in such a delightful way. There had been many a night when he had dreamt of Jon, and he wondered if maybe. Think of the prophecy. Ice and fire, the dragon needs 3 heads, the prince who was promised. You cannot afford to be selfish. Another voice in his head whispered, and Rhaegar wondered if this was how it started for his father, listening to the voices inside his head. So many people had said that Aerys hadn't been much different from Rhaegar when he had been younger, and the thought that might one day turn into him had caused several nightmares before and would most likely cause them for several nights to come. He shook his head wildly. He would most likely cause himself to reach his father's state if he thought about it too much. He found himself standing outside of his mother's room. He had apparently been so caught in his thoughts that he hadn't realized that he made the fairly lengthy walk from his study to her room. He could hear Viserys laughing loudly inside, and he could almost hear his mother's sweet ladylike giggle if he strained his ears. A part of Rhaegar hated himself for having to go in there and ruin it, but he knew that he had. His father had burned men alive for less than disobeying him, even if it was just not joining him for dinner. Rhaegar took in a deep breath and pushed the door of his mother's room open and walked in. Viserys, who had been laying on the floor playing with a toy dragon carved out of wood, gasped and jumped to his feet with a cry. "Rhaegar, The little boy rushed over to his older brother and threw his arms around his legs. He looked up at Roriga with wide adoring eyes. Mother said that you would have dinner with us tonight, but I didn't believe her. I thought you would be too busy. Well, now you always know that I will never lie to you, my love. Rolla said with a gentle smile and stood to greet her elder son, walking over to him and cupped his cheek. Hello my boy, are you well? Roriga sighed and shook his head. Mother. He began and hesitated for a moment when he saw the worried expression cross his mother's face. Father has commanded us to dine with him tonight. Rolla didn't have much time to react as Viserys reacted first. No. It was just supposed to be the three of us eating in Mother's room. I wanted to show you all my new toys. Father won't care. I won't go, you can't make me. The little boy screamed, his face turning red and tears flowing down his cheeks. Rolla quickly scooped up her son and began to hush him. Hush my love, it's all right. It's going to be okay, your father will be glad to see you. Roriga didn't think he had ever seen his mother lie before, and he knew how hard it was for her, considering she had just promised his brother that she would never lie to him. I hate him, he scares me and I want him to go away. I want him to die. Viserys muttered, his voice muffled from having his head buried in his mother's neck. My love, you must not say that. Do you understand me? You must not say that. Rolla stressed and Viserys simply sobbed. Rolla sighed and looked up at Roriga. Tell your father that we will be there shortly, my dear. She said before she turned and carried Viserys over to her large chair and rubbed his back to try and comfort him. Roriga nodded and left the room. He wanted to try and offer Viserys some comfort as well, but he knew that his mother would be better at it and he would simply get in the way. He sighed and slowly began to make his way to his father's dining room. Underscore 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 underscore. Roriga felt uncomfortable as he sat at the other end of the table. He was at the exact opposite of his father and he was staring at him unblinkingly. His father had taken to that habit lately, hoping that if the person he stared at was plotting against him, then it would break them and them to confess, even if they did nothing wrong. His father looked terrible. He was rail thin from not eating enough due to fearing being poisoned and having a food tester eating his food, but even when the tester survived he still did not eat in fear of the poison being slow acting. His hair was so long now that it went all the way down to the bottom of his back. He had a long beard and his nails had grown so long that they were actually starting to hook. Viserys and his mother were sitting at either side of his father, and while his mother was used to hiding how she felt around her father, Viserys was not, and he kept glancing between his mother and his brother for help. Roriga's heart swelled with pity because he understood how hard it was to be near their father. His descent into madness had begun when Roriga was around Viserys' age after all. Thankfully the servants soon brought their food in and placed it on the table so they could just look at their plates. They managed to make it through the first two courses without any problem, but during the main course, a roast pig stuffed with grapes and grains and served with potatoes, his father started to mutter darkly. Is everything all right? Rolla asked her husband gently, not wanting to provoke him. That foreign whore of Roriga's has married Ricard's spare. Aes spat darkly. The serpent and the wolf plot and scheme. They think I don't know. But I do. I see them. Princess Elia had to marry someone, father. I'm sure there is no plot there. Roriga tried to soothe, but it only seemed to enrage the king. Do you think I am a fool? I am the king. I see a plot where there is one. Foolish fucking boy. Out of my sight, now. Aes stood up and grabbed Rolla's arm. You. With me. Father. Please, I didn't, he tried to say, but his mother shot him a look and glanced at Viserys, who was cowering and crying into his hands. Rhaegar slacked and watched helplessly as his mother was dragged off. Rhaegar walked over to his brother and picked him up and whispered into his ear. Don't worry, little brother, it won't always be like this. I promise you. His father had sealed his fate now. He would not allow this any longer. Soon, he would sit the Iron Throne and his father would be rotting in the worst cell that Roriga could find. End of chapter 11. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 12. Elia hummed as she put the finishing touches on her new needlework. Ashura was sitting in a chair near her with Lauren sitting in her lap humming to her daughter gently. She had found that she hadn't been short of things to do in this last month in Winterfell. While Catelyn may have been the one who would become the lady of the castle, Elia had taken it upon herself to familiarize herself with as much of the history of Winterfell as she could, as well as the servants. Thinking of that made her remember an event that occurred during her first week at Winterfell. She and Ashura had mainly been keeping to themselves, aside from her new family and Catelyn, for the most part, but eventually they had decided to introduce themselves, for lack of a better word. They had started off in the kitchens and met the cook and scullery maids. The cook had been a large woman with curly ginger hair and missing her two front teeth named Agatha. Her voice had been loud and she spoke bluntly and to her staff as if they were a bunch of particularly dim children, but she seemed to be a fairly nice woman aside from that. After saying goodbye to them, they had gone to meet the stable master, Hullen, a man with long brown hair and leathery looking skin and calloused hands. The man had spoken gruffly and seemed a bit offset by Elia and Ashura's appearance, though whether that was due to the fact that he didn't think that the new ladies from the south would bother to visit him, or because he was taken back by Elia's skin, they couldn't be sure. Elia had been glad to see her horse, though. She had ridden in the wheelhouse after she promised Doran that she would, but he had sent Swift Ash with them and she was glad of it. She loved her horse, and while horse riding was never high on her list of interests, she still enjoyed it and she would rather do it on her horse than any other. Swift Ash was called that because he had an ashy grey coat and he was a swift runner. Elia never claimed to be a very creative person, but the name worked for him. She actually got quite a bit of amusement out of the look on Ashura's face whenever she told anyone that she had named her horse after her friend. Swift had seemed glad to see her, as she hadn't been able to find the time to visit the stable, and the last time she had rode him was during her wedding, and she promised him that she would take him out for a ride soon, even though she knew that horse couldn't understand her. After leaving the stable, Ashura and Elia decided to go and introduce themselves to Sir Roderick Castle, a man in his early 30s who Elia had seen from a distance many times before but had never spoken to. They didn't manage to make it to the sparring area, however before they could get there they were sidetracked by a giant who could only speak a single word over and over. When Elia had bumped into him, she nearly had a heart attack. The man, who at least as tall as her good father if not taller, and looked down at her with a blank expression for a moment before a wide smile appeared on his face and his eyes light up. "Hodder," he had said. To say that both she and Ashura had been confused would be an understatement. They had never seen this giant before, and now he had seemed to appear out of nowhere and could only seem to say one word. It did not take either of them long to realize they were dealing with someone of simple wits. They were both a little unsure of what to do, as while the man did not seem threatening, he could only say the one word, and neither of them had ever interacted with anyone like the man before. Then thankfully, and strangely, an old woman who was slightly bent over seemingly appeared out of nowhere and shooed the man away, telling him not to be silly. The woman turned to face them and looked them over, Elia specifically, and spoke in a voice that was rough with age. "So, you're the one who married Sweet Ned?" The woman was clearly a servant, and Elia imagined that if cared more about social status then she would be offended by the old woman referring to her husband as Ned and not as Lord Eddard, but she was never too fussed about status, to be honest. She had wanted to marry Rhaegar because she loved him, not because she had wanted to be the queen, and the woman clearly spoke in good fun and had much affection for her sweet Ned. The woman referred to herself as Old Nan. Apparently she had been looking after the children of Winterfell for a very long time. Well, at least that's what she thought she was doing. According to Ned, most of what Old Nan did was tell a lot of stories, mostly about things north of the wall like the Night King and the others. Still, Elia had grown fond of the old woman in the past month. Listening to all her stories had not only allowed Elia to learn a great deal more about the north, but she also had a great deal of stories about her new family. The two women actually had something of a tradition. Every day when Elia had some free time and she wasn't spending it with Ned or with Ash, then she would go and visit the old woman with a pot of peppermint tea and lavender biscuits, and the two women would spend their time telling one another stories. All in all, Elia thought that she, and Ashura, had managed to find their place in Winterfell. Elia looked up as the door to the room opened and Catelyn walked in. The woman smiled at Elia and Elia returned it gladly. Catelyn was a more than agreeable companion, and Elia and Ashura had enjoyed her company greatly. At the moment, however, the woman seemed to have a sense of melancholy around her. "Is everything all right, Catelyn?" Elia asked as she gestured at the chair next to her, and Catelyn sat down in it. "I'm fine, I just..." Catelyn sighed heavily and looked down at her. "I do not think that Brandon likes me." Elia quickly shot a glance at Ashura, who was looking down at Lauren, who was currently in the middle of dozing off. More specifically, she was trying to look at anywhere other than Caitlin. Elia looked back at Caitlin and placed her hand on her shoulder. I am sure that is not at all true, and if he doesn't, then he is the stupidest man to ever live. Caitlin looked up and her blue eyes were swimming in tears, and Elia's heart felt a stab of pity for her. But I am to marry him. And he doesn't even like me. My father ordered me to stay here so we could get to know one another, but he always avoids me, or he finds other things that need his attention, or when we do spend time together he simply ignores me. Elia didn't know what to say that could be of any comfort, so she simply reached forward and started to rub Caitlin's back, hoping that would offer her even the slightest comfort. Caitlin did seem to take some solace in the comfort, as she did not burst out crying, but it was clear for all to see that she was still upset. And then Lauren, brought out of her doze by Caitlin's shouting and crying, hopped out of her mother's lap, toddled over to the grown woman and gently patted her on the knee. Feel better? She said with a bright smile. Caitlin's eyes went wide as she stared down at the little girl for a moment before she looked up at Ashura. Ashura held her gaze for a moment before she nodded her head, and then Caitlin reached down and picked Lauren up and placed her in her lap. Thank you, Lauren, I am sure I will. Elia smiled proudly at her friend. She knew how difficult that was for her, considering who Lauren's father was and how protective she was of Lauren. The door opened again, and this time Lyanna walked in. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail and she was dressed in a simply grey frock. My father said he wanted to talk to you, Lady Caitlin, so please dry your eyes and come with me to see him. Lady Caitlin was quite upset a moment ago. Lady Lyanna, please give us a moment. Elia said diplomatically, but Lyanna simply looked annoyed. Father said I was to bring her to him directly. I do have better things to do than wait around here for you. Lyanna then smirked. What exactly is the problem, Lady Cat? Did you drop a stitch? What is wrong with you? Ashura said as she jumped out of her chair, her violet eyes glowing with anger. I can understand why you might not have liked us at first, but we've been here a month and you haven't even tried to get to know us while we have tried with you. You could at least try and be courteous to us. We've been with you. Lyanna reeled back for a moment before she got closer to the other woman. There is nothing wrong with me, I just don't see the point in getting upset over every little thing. Letting your emotions control you, it's pathetic. I won't ever be anything like you. It's pathetic. And I certainly won't open my legs to any man who gives me the slightest interest and ended up with a babe in my belly. Before Lyanna could continue, Ashura reached out and slapped Lyanna straight across the face. Lyanna held her cheek and looked at Ashura with wide eyes, and Elia and Caitlin stared at both of them in shock, neither of them knowing what would happen next. Lauren whimpered and cuddled closer into Caitlin, who wrapped her arm around her. Then Lyanna slapped Ashura across her cheek. Then Ashura slapped her back. Then Lyanna. Then Ashura. This threatened to go on for a while until Elia got in between them and pushed them both away from one another. Enough. Both of you. Are you women or are you children? Now, Lyanna. You seem to think that being ladylike makes you weak. Elia asked, and for a moment Lyanna was quiet, her lips pursed together before she nodded. Elia nodded. Then I shall prove you wrong. Please show Lady Caitlin to your father's solar and then meet me in the training grounds. Lyanna stared at her for a moment before she let out a mocking laugh. You want to fight me, really? Are you stupid or just suicidal? Just confident. Elia said with a smile. Lyanna sighed. Fine, don't say I didn't warn you. Lyanna turned on her feet and left the room. Caitlin sighed and stood up and left the room, but not before handing Lauren back to Ashura. Are you sure about this? Ashura asked her friend as she sat back down and picked up her needlework. She wasn't worried about her because she knew that Elia was more than capable of taking care of herself, but she was slightly worried about how it would look to the others, especially Lord Eddard. I am more than capable of dealing with her, and besides, do you honestly think I would let the little cow speak to you and slap you like that? Elia asked, and Ashura shook her head. She knew that Elia was just protecting her like she would do for her. Elia nodded and focused back on her needlework. She wasn't going to go until she finished this. Underscore 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 underscore. Lyanna stood in the middle of the training ground and picked up her favorite sword to use. She had always beat Benjen with this sword. She didn't know what Elia was thinking, but it would be fun to beat the snooty little princess. At the moment the training grounds were empty as Sir Roderick was helping Maester Kusal teach Benjen about war tactics. She was never taught about anything like that, and only because she was a woman. It didn't matter how much stronger or faster or smarter or how much of a better swordsman she was than her baby brother. All that mattered to the world was that she was a woman, that she had a place to fill in the world. That's why she was so angry at Elia and Ashura and Caitlin. They clearly weren't stupid, but they had given in. They'd given up and made peace with only being wives and mothers. It made her sad, and that made her angry. A moment later she was drawn out of her thoughts by the sound of a sword being taken out of its stand. She looked up and saw Elia, but how she was dressed struck her. Instead of the red or yellow dresses she usually wore, she was now wearing a set of brown leather armor. Ashura was standing a little ways behind her, holding her daughter in her arms and glaring at Lyanna. "Are you sure you really want to do this?" "I'm good with a sword. I'm a much better swordsman than Benjen," Lyanna said as she and Elia began to circle around one another. "Congratulations, you are a better fighter than a 10-year-old. I am incredibly impressed," Elia said, and she couldn't help but laugh at the dumbfounded expression on her face. "All right, enough talk," Lyanna shouted and swung her sword at Elia. The swords were blunted, but a blade was still a blade, so she had to be careful. Elia brought up her blade and blocked all of Lyanna's blows. "I've beaten Ned and I've beaten Brandon before. I can beat you as well," Lyanna shouted as she kept up the pace she was attacking, but no matter how fast she swung or how hard she hit, Elia simply kept blocking every single blow like it was nothing. "Lyanna Stark, stop this now." The loud voice of Lord Rickard Stark echoed around the training yard. Lyanna and Elia looked to see Lord Rickard storming towards them with Brandon, Ned, Benjen and Caitlin following behind him. Lyanna realized with a glower that Caitlin must have told her father about what was happening, and now she was in for a bollocking. "Good father." "Wait," Elia shouted, and Rickard turned to look at her. "Let us finish. I do not ask you to approve or understand, but know that this is important to me and I must finish, please." Lord Rickard looked at his good daughter for a moment before he sighed and stepped back. Both Ned and Brandon looked surprised, and Ned worried for his wife, that he had given in so easily. He almost never gave in. And so the fight continued. Lyanna kept up her aggressive approach, but Elia kept easily blocking every blow. When Lyanna got in close, Elia swung as hard as she could with her sword, and Lyanna's sword went flying from her hand. Elia then held the point of her sword just an inch away from Lyanna's throat. "We are more alike than you think, Lyanna. The only true difference is I never needed to have my brothers let me win," Elia said before she threw her sword to the side and began to walk away. She only managed to take a few steps before she suddenly started to feel dizzy. She realized with a start what was about to happen, and by the look on her face and the fact she began to walk towards her, so did Ashura. With a violent upheaval, Elia emptied the contents of her stomach onto the muddy ground and fell down to it. The last thing she heard before was dead to the world was Caitlin screaming and Ned and Ashura calling her name. End of chapter 12. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 13. Elia walked down the corridors of the Palace of Sunspear, trying not mind all the snakes that slithered around on the floor as they fled from the great green blaze that burned in on the rooms. There was thick black smoke coloring the air, but she had no difficulty in breathing it. What was she doing here again? Where was Ned? She needed to find Doran. He would know what to do. 8 snakes, larger than any of the others and colored yellow, followed behind her. Elia felt no fear. She had walked among vipers her entire life and not a one had bit her. They followed her loyally, like a pack. As she approached Doran's solar, she looked down when she, a rough tongue licking at her fingers. She looked down and saw a large grey wolf with solemn eyes looking up at her. Elia raised her hand and gently petted its head, and the wolf let out a contented growl. She pushed open the door of the solar and stepped in. The wolf and the snakes disappeared, and she gasped when she, who was sitting in the chair behind the table. It wasn't Doran. It was her mother. She didn't seem to notice or even care that the chair she was sitting on was made of hundreds of snakes that slithered all around, nor did she seem to care about the giant wolf and the large that were fighting a large red spider with 7 legs in the corner of the room. All she did was take one look at Elia and smiled. She climbed out of her throne of serpents and walked over to her daughter and held her at arm's length. "Hello my love, how beautiful you have become. I remember a sickly little girl who used to hide behind my skirts. Where has she gone? She hasn't gone anywhere. I still feel like a little girl. I wish I could say that I felt like a grown woman, but I don't. Elia said with tears in her eyes. The last time she had seen her was at the end of her life, lying weakly in her bed. She had not been a young woman when Elia was born, and no matter how strong you were, no one could withstand the ravages of time. You never feel as though you have grown up, my sweet girl. Her mother whispered as gently pushed her hair behind her ears and cupped her face gently. You are never really ready to face the world. What is important is that you always do the best that you can, and that you be strong for the ones you love, and when you need them to be, they are strong for you. This is a dream, isn't it? Elia whispered. Is it? Her mother asked with a amused grin on her face. Perhaps, but the question is, whose dream is it? She gently took her daughter's hand and led her out onto the balcony. There was no sign of sand spear. All that the balcony overlooked was an endless desert of red sand. In the sky there was a large silver dragon flying high, its wings beating almost lazily. Far beneath it in the red sand were a lioness and a she-wolf, circling around one another. There are many trials to come, my love. You must be ready if you and those who you love are to survive. Her mother said as stared off into the distance, her eyes seeming far away. I wish I could do more, but I am beyond your reach. Just know that no matter what, I shall love you. From this day until your last. Mother, I am afraid. Elia admitted tearfully. What can I tell you to make it better? Her mother asked her quietly. Tell me that you won't leave me. Elia pleaded. She couldn't do this without her. She was stranded far away from people who loved her unconditionally. She was fond of her husband, perhaps she even loved him, and Ashura was a massive help, but it wasn't the same as being around people who she knew would die for her. Her mother said nothing, simply looked at her with a look of sadness in her dark eyes. She had never seen her mother look at her like that. Elia reached out with her hand to touch her mother, but as soon as her fingers brushed against her mother's shoulder, she vanished, dissolving like mist in the bright sun. No. Mother. Don't leave me here. I don't want to be on my own. Elia shouted. She quickly wiped her head around to see if she could see any sign of her, but there was no sign. It was like she had never been there at all. It was suddenly too much, and Elia collapsed to the ground and sobbed. She honestly thought that she wouldn't be able to stop herself, but she stopped when she felt something encircling her arms and the sound of paws padding against the floor. She looked up and saw the white wolf standing in front of her with the large wolf, the she-wolf, and two other wolves standing behind him. Two serpents, one red and one green, encircled her arms and gazed upon her face, and 8 yellow snakes slithered around her in a circle as 2 little green snakes slithered into her lap and felt herself being bathed in the light of brightest star in the heavens. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone in her entire life. All too suddenly, however, the light was gone, being blocked out by a large, looming shadow. Elia looked onto the balcony and she felt her breath catch in her throat as she gazed upon what was casting the long-reaching shadow. A dragon, far larger than the silver one that had been flying through the sky a moment ago, yet it still somehow managed to perch itself on the ledge. Elia couldn't tell what color it was due to how dark it had suddenly gotten, but she could tell one thing about the dragon immediately. It had 3 heads. The middle head of the dragon screamed and 2 streams of fire shot out of the left and right head, and Elia woke up screaming in bed, Ned and Ashura jumping back in surprise. She kept screaming and couldn't breathe. Ned quickly rushed to her and held her close. My lady. You are all right, please be calm. He gently kissed the top of her head. You were only dreaming. I'll go and fetch the maester. Ashura said as she left the room, but not before casting one last look back at her friend. After a few moments, Elia managed to calm down as she realized that she was safe. There was no dragon here. All the dragons were long dead. I'm sorry, Ned, I know I was only dreaming, but it was very real. It seemed like I was truly there. May I ask what it was about, Elia? Ned asked as he gently stroked her back. He didn't want to press her as she had only just woken up. I dreamed that I saw my mother. Elia admitted. She did several years ago. She was not a young woman. She had me and I was still rather young. I am very sorry, Elia. Ned said while gently holding her close. We did hear about your mother. If it helps, I do know how you feel. My mother died a few years ago as well. I dream of her sometimes as well. Elia said nothing and simply let her husband speak, gently stroking his arm. I'm sorry, Ned. Ned cleared his throat and nodded. I was worried about you, he said, changing topics rather quickly. We all were. I am touched, Elia said, meaning every word. And I am honestly fine. Such a thing like this can happen when I exert myself. I do hope I didn't scare you too badly. How long have I been asleep? Nearly a day and a half, Ned said, and then his eyes widened and he pulled away. You must be hungry. Forgive me for not realizing sooner. I will go and fetch you some food. Ned was already getting off of the bed but stopped when Elia placed her arm on her husband's arm. No, please don't leave me. Not yet, Elia asked with a small tremor in her voice. Whenever something like this happens, Doran or Oberyn, they always stay with me. Make sure that I am not alone. I do not wish to be on my own. Of course, my lady, Ned said as he returned to his original position, holding Elia again when she asked him to. If I may ask, I know you were sick, but why did you not tell me like things like this could happen? I am your husband. If you could faint or you feel unwell, then I must know. I always feel unwell, Elia admitted, and then sighed as her husband looked at her with worry burning in his grey eyes, and Elia sighed greatly. I was born very small and nearly a moon's turn before I should have been. My mother has always had trouble conceiving children and she had several miscarriages, and before I and Oberyn were born she had 2 other sons. Both of them died when they were babes. Brothers she never knew, Mors and Oliver. She often found herself wondering what they would be like if they had lived longer. Would they've been adventurers like Oberyn? Scholars like Doran? Would they have been neither? Instead becoming artists or mercenaries, or perhaps even run away to join the Night's Watch? She would never know, and that saddened her beyond measure. My mother was told that I would likely not live long. I was smaller than any of her other babes, and our Maester said it would be a gift from the gods if I lived for a full moon's turn, but live I did, Elia said with a smile. My mother said that I would live, and I did. My little heart just kept on beating. However, I was still a small babe and I was often very sick. You've heard of how warm it is in Dawn. Well, my mother would still have me bundled in blankets regardless, even on the hottest of days when steel threatened to melt, Elia said as she recalled one of earliest memories, sitting with her mother as she watched children jump and splash in the water while she sat with her mother fully dressed. I often have deep aches in my bones. It never stops actually, but I've learned to hide it. Ned opened his mouth to speak, but Elia held up her hand to stop him. If you are about to say that you wish to tell the Maester, then I will not stop you, but I must tell you that there is no point. Our Maester examined me and told me that he could find no cause for the pain. It is simply something I have to live with. Ned seemed extremely upset at this revelation, but it also seemed like he realized that there was nothing he could do to stop his wife's pain, so he simply nodded and beckoned her to continue. When I do get sick, I am often bedridden for months. I also sometimes get very lightheaded, Elia said as looked up at Ned. I do not faint very often. I can count the number of times that it has happened on one hand, and I do not vomit often, and it only really happens when I do a lot all at once. And I. Elia sighed. This was what she had been dreading for a very long time. She was almost certain that Doran had informed Lord Ricard, but she wasn't sure how much Ned had been made aware. According to my Maester, it will be very difficult for me to conceive a child. The room was silent and Elia looked down quickly. She couldn't bear to see the look of disappointment. She did not think that Ned would hate her. He was too good a man for that, but what in the world was worse than the disappointment of a good person? Elia gently felt Ned cup her chin, and he gently turned it so he could look her in the eye. His eyes were full of understanding and compassion, and something that she would like to hope was love. He gently leaned in and kissed her. They stayed like that for a long moment, kissing and holding one another. It was Elia who eventually broke the kiss, and she did so with great reluctance, but she had to ask a question. Where is Lyanna? Ned's soft grey eyes suddenly hardened. She's been confined to her room and she only comes out for meals. Father is furious with her. I am furious with her. I get the feeling that you being furious with her is something of an uncommon occurrence, Elia observed, and Ned nodded. I honestly thought that there was nothing she could do to make me angry with her, to make me. He didn't finish the sentence, but Elia knew how he was going to finish it. But, when I saw you faint, I was so angry with her because, my lady, I think I. Before Ned could finish, the door opened and Ashura and Maester Kusal walked into the room, and Ned and Elia both let out a sigh of annoyance. Forgive me for intruding, my lord, but when Lady Ashura that told me that the princess was awake, I thought that I had best come as soon as possible. Kusal said with a small bow. You needn't apologize, wise Maester, you did the right thing. Ned got off of the bed so the Maester could get closer to examine Elia. How do you feel, princess? The Maester asked as he took Elia's wrist and felt her pulse, nodding with a small frown when he noticed that it was a little faster than he would have liked. Quite all right, Maester, this is not the first time that such a thing has happened. Elia said as he sat down next to her. And when it did happen, what did your Maester recommend? Kusal asked. That I was confined to bed rest and have all my meals brought to me, and I avoid anything that might cause me distress. Elia said as she remembered one of the many times the cranky old Maester back at Sunspear had confined her to her bed. Well, I am afraid I must agree. Kusal said as he stood up, groaning as he did. I would also recommend a little milk of the poppy mixed into a glass of water before you go to bed, but we can discuss that later. I would recommend that we leave the princess to rest, my lord, my lady. Both Ned and Ashura nodded, but before they left, Ashura went over and hugged her friend and kissed her forehead. Ned kissed her on the lips and both were about to leave the room with the Maester when Elia called out. Ned, would mind staying with me? Just until I fall asleep. Ned looked back at his wife and nodded with a smile. Ashura left the room with the Kusal and shut the door behind them. Elia and Ned laid down on the bed and rested their head on the pillows, wrapping their arms around one another. What were you going to say to me when Ashura and the Maester walked in? She asked with eyes already closed. Do I need to say it? Do you truly not already know? Ned asked as he gently stroked her face. I may already know, but I would like to hear it just the same. Elia said with a contented hum as Ned stroked her face. Very well then, I love you, Elia. I love you so much. Ned whispered as he rested her forehead against Elia's. And I love you, Ned. Elia said, opening her eyes and kissing her husband. And there the two of them stayed, their arms wrapped around one another and kissing and repeating their declarations until they fell asleep. End of chapter 13. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 14. Jaime sighed as he watched the landscape slowly roll past the windows of the wheelhouse. He hated it in here, it was always too hot and he had no idea how Sister was able to stand it. He would much rather be on a horse, galloping through the countryside and feeling the air blow through his hair, but he had promised father that he would stay in the wheelhouse. Speaking of his father, he was still angry with him for forcing Tyrion to stay at Casterly Rock. He clearly didn't care about his brother's well-being, so the only reason he had kept him back was to stop him from shaming the family name. He had admitted as much. He missed his brother, he loved his sister more than anything in this world, but she was not the most pleasant of company at the moment, with her constant talk of how wonderful and handsome her future husband was and how she was going to be such a good queen. It was driving him insane. She didn't even seem to care about how each word was like a dagger to his heart. Didn't she understand how much he loved her? Didn't she understand that he couldn't go on without her? That was why he wished Tyrion was here. He would roll his eyes and make fun of everything their sister said, not only to irritate her but to make him feel better about how she didn't seem to care that she was breaking his heart with every word of praise that she heaped onto her silver prince. It added insult to injury that his sister was especially beautiful today. Her long blonde hair was pulled back into a braid and the dress she was wearing showed off her pale skin and quite a bit of her cleavage. Her neck was unadorned and he couldn't help but lean in to press a kiss to it while he groped one of her breasts through her dress. Now he was glad that Tyrion wasn't here. Jaime. Cersei said warningly as she scooted away from her brother and shot him a glare. We can't do that anymore. I am going to be Rhaegar's wife. What would he think of me if he knew what we were doing? He would never look at me or touch me. Jaime at the moment was distracted by what she said about not doing this anymore. Doing what? Being together. Showing her how much he loved her. Is that what she meant? And he didn't want Rhaegar to touch her. Given this his mother and father are brother and sister, I am sure he won't mind too much. Why, it just means you having something to talk about. Jaime said bitterly as he crossed his arms. Your father and mother are related, how interesting. Tell me, my love, do you know I fuck my brother? He mocked while making voice high, making it a near-perfect imitation of his sister's in his personal opinion. Cersei's glare intensified. That is not funny, Jaime, I've been waiting for this. For him my entire life, and you will not ruin this for me. Do you understand me? Oh, sweet sister, I would never ruin anything for you. Jaime said with a sickly sweet smile on his face while his eyes burned with rage. Why are you doing this to me? We came into this world together, we belong together. I love you, Cersei, you don't need him. Let's just go, we can run across the narrow sea and just be together. I do need him. I will be a queen, father has promised me that ever since I was a little girl, and I will be queen. Marrying you will not get me a crown. Cersei stressed, not sure why her brother was being so stupid. Now stop it. Stop being a child, I will marry Rhaegar and you will find yourself a wife that father will approve of, understood? Yes. Jaime growled before he turned his head to look at anything other than his sister. Anger and sadness battled for dominance inside of him. I hope your dragon makes you very happy. I am sure he will. Cersei spat as she looked over her dress. And you've no right to complain about anything I do, you left me first. Jaime turned his head to look at his sister with confusion and disbelief playing on his face. What in the name of all the gods are you on about? You left me first, you left me to squire for that fat old lord. Cersei said bitterly. I begged you not to go but you left anyway, you have no right to judge me. Jaime looked at his sister like she had just grown a second head. She couldn't be serious, could she? Do you mean Lord Crickehall? That wasn't my choice. I begged father not to send me away but you know that he wouldn't listen to me. I would never leave you by choice and I hated every second that I was away from you. And I didn't choose to marry Rhaegar but I am going to make the best of it, so why are you angry with me? Cersei asked as she crossed her arms. I am angry because while it may be father ordering you to do it you have no problem going through with it. You will sleep with the prince and be happy about it, and I am angry because the woman I love will not stop going on about how wonderful her new husband will be and how much she is going to enjoy being his queen. That is why I am angry with you. Jaime ranted and then had to take a moment to catch his breath. Cersei, don't you love me? Jaime asked and he hated how weak his voice sounded but he couldn't help it. He loved Cersei more than anything and she wasn't willing to fight to be with him, at least not as hard as he was willing to fight with her. I do love you, Jaime, and I will always need you. Cersei said with a sweet smile as she took her brother's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze as she leaned in and gave him a gentle kiss and then whispered into his ear. But I want to be the queen, I need to be the queen. I need it more than I need air. Please understand. Jaime wanted to scream, he wanted to shout and shake his sister till she understood that she didn't need a crown, she didn't need to be a queen when she had him. They could go to the free cities and he would work as a sellsword, they would go to sleep together in the same bed and be able to love one another without anyone ever knowing the truth. It was a beautiful dream but he knew that Cersei would never go along with it. She wanted to be the queen and the queen she would be even if she had to move all 7 heavens and all 7 hells and slay all the gods single-handedly to do it. And the worst thing was that no matter how much it would hurt him to see his sister in the arms of another man he would still help her in anything she asked of him. He was never able to deny his sister anything. I understand, Cersei, I'm sorry, sweet sister. I did not mean to yell at you. He pressed a kiss to her forehead and smoothed her blonde hair below her braid. Forgive me. I forgive you. Cersei said with a smug smile, as if by doing so she had bestowed onto her brother the greatest honor. And in time you can join the Kingsguard, and then we'll never be far from one another. That will be wonderful. Jaime muttered as he turned to look back through the window. He didn't want to talk about this anymore. For what seemed like an eternity they sat in almost complete silence, the only noise being the creak of the wheels beneath them. The wheelhouse then suddenly came to a stop and Cersei gasped excitedly as she poked her head out her window while Jaime did the same on his side. The first thing anyone ever noticed about King's Landing was the Red Keep. At the very top of Aegon's Hill it loomed, a red bloated spider with 7 legs. Down below was the city itself, with the Great September of Baelor being the first thing that caught the eye after the keep. Jaime knew that most would assume that King's Landing was all perfumed nobles and extravagant riches, but he knew it wasn't true, when he was squiring for Lord Crickehall. Most of the time he had stayed in the Red Keep, but when he was bored he had snuck out and he had gone exploring, even though he knew if his father found out it would be worse than the time he had found him dangling over the cliff face of Casterly. He still hadn't forgiven Cersei for telling their father that he had been climbing. While he had been exploring he found that only a small fraction of the city had any real wealth, While it was true that most of the city weren't languishing in flea bottom, the people were still more poor than wealthy, and he had received more than his share of dirty looks. It was clear to everyone who saw him that he was highborn, and that had sent him running back to the Red Keep. Why Circe and father were so desperate to be involved in this place was beyond him. He would rather just leave this place to slowly rot and languish at the hands of the Mad King, but he knew his opinion meant little to his father, at least it did in this matter. "Oh, Jaime, isn't it beautiful?" Circe said with a wild grin as she took in the city. "Yes, very beautiful," Jaime muttered. "If you don't mind the smell of shit." "Why have we stopped?" Circe asked, annoyed as she glanced around at their father's guards on their horses. "Prince Rhaegar is expecting me and I will not keep him waiting." "Yes, Lady Circe," the guards said, and the horses and the wheelhouse counted down the road. Circe nodded satisfied and pulled her head back into the wheelhouse at the same time as Jaime did. To get into the city, the wheelhouse would normally pass through the Dragon Gate, as that was the gate that the King's Road ran through, but there was a large queue waiting to go through, and Circe was clearly impatient to get to her future husband and wouldn't wait any longer. The closest gate that was nearest was the old gate, and that wasn't good, as to pass through the gate they would still need to have everything checked, but it was also the longest way to Aegon's Hill. But Circe did not care, as she wanted to get in the city and she wanted to go now, and Jaime and the knights knew better than to argue with her, but she would soon come to regret it. Because to get to Aegon's Hill, the wheelhouse and the host would have to go through Flea Bottom. Jaime had never made it to Flea Bottom when he went on his journeys around the city, but he heard the stories that were spread around the court, that the people there were nearly savage from their hunger and were covered in dirt, and they would eat rat droppings if they could find nothing else. The lords and ladies made it sound like they were monsters instead of people who were simply desperate, but Jaime knew that was the way of the world. It made it easy for them to live their lives of utter comfort if they didn't have to think about those below suffering as human. It wasn't that he was in any place to judge. He was highborn as well, and he profited from the low being kept in their place, and he had no plans to change the way the world worked. You just had to make the best of what you got. It wasn't his fault that he got an advantage for others. Heavy frown marred Circe's face, and her eyes narrowed as she looked out the window. She snorted in disgust before she spoke. "Gods, look at them, Jaime. They are wretched. Why does the king put up with these peasants ruining his city?" She asked as if she expected him to have an actual answer. "Because they outnumber us 10 to 1, and if the king tried to do anything about them, then it would end with all of us torn to pieces." Jaime thought to himself as he glanced out the window to look at the dozens of dirty faces glaring at the wheelhouse rolling past, and he knew that if it weren't for his father's knights, then they would be upon the wheelhouse and tip it over and tear them apart. He wished now that he hadn't packed his sword away into one of his trunks. He then realized that Circe was staring at him, waiting for an answer that he hadn't given her yet. "I do not know, Circe. I'm sure the king knows what is best." "Well, when Rhaegar is king and I am the queen, I will do something about these filthy urchins," Circe said with a smile before she turned back to look out the window, her eyes scanning hatefully over every dirty little face she saw. Jaime couldn't help but wonder what he did was so terrible that the gods had decided to curse him by making him love such a hateful woman. Thankfully they finally made their way out of Flea Bottom, and their surroundings became much richer, and Jaime wasn't sure if he was more grateful than they were out of immediate danger, or because Circe seemed to calm down. The rest of the ride to the Red Keep was spent in silence, and Jaime heaved a sigh of relief when they stopped in front of the Great Keep. He really needed to stretch his legs. As soon as Circe and Jaime stepped out of the wheelhouse, a large pale-skinned man with long red hair came towards them and seemed to study them intensely. "You are Lady Circe?" he asked his sister. "My prince has been expecting you." "I am Lord Connington. He sent me to escort you." "Excellent," Circe said with a pleased smile as she stepped forward. "Take me to him." She turned to face her guards. "You will all wait here or do whatever it is you do in your own time. I honestly do not care." "Jaime, will you come with me?" Jaime would normally say yes, as he didn't not like the idea of his sister going off with a strange man, even though he knew Lord Connington and that Circe was perfectly safe with him if the whispers going around the court were true, unless he killed her in a jealous rage for trying to take his precious Sliver prince from him. "No, I'll give you and your future husband some time on your own," Jaime said, trying to pretend that saying those words did not break his heart. Circe smiled brightly, and Jaime couldn't help but smile back. Cersei always looked beautiful, but she looked even more so when she smiled, and when she smiled like she did now, and the sun made her hair glow like was gold mined straight from one of Casterly's veins. She looked like the most beautiful woman in the world. Jon offered his arm and Cersei took it and he led her inside. Jaime sighed and told the guards to place the trunks into their apartments while he went for a walk. He wasn't sure how long he was walking around the Red Keep, but he eventually found his way to a covered bridge that overlooked the training yard. As he looked down, his jaw nearly dropped when he noticed who two of the knights standing in the yard, sparring with one another, were. Arthur Dayne and Lewin Martell, both men of the King's Guard, were dressed in their shining white armor, both wielding their swords, Dayne wielding the fabled dawn that marked him as the Sword of the Morning. Neither of the two knights seemed to have the upper hand despite the stories of how fierce a swordsman Arthur Dayne was supposed to be, and Jaime couldn't help but wonder if perhaps the younger knight was holding back. Regardless, they were both glorious in the way that they fought, to the way that they held themselves. Impressive, aren't they? A man who had crept up behind Jaime asked, and Jaime turned to see who it was who had surprised him. He was a lean man in perhaps his early 20s with bronze skin and dark curly hair with eyes so brown they were almost as black as coal. He wore an arrogant smirk on his face as he looked Jaime up and down and smiled in a way that almost seemed to be approving, if not a little hungry. "You're Jaime, Tywin Lannister's eldest son." Yes, I am," Jaime said as he felt his guard slowly come up. "And who are you, sir?" The man chucked, a deep-sounding thing. "Forgive me, I am used to everyone knowing who I am back home, and I suppose it was foolish of me to think that you would remember me. I am Oberyn Martell." Jaime had been talking to one of the princes of Dorne, and he could have smacked himself for not realizing sooner. The man was clearly Dornish, and what other Dornishman other than a Martell or a Dane would come to King's Landing? "Forgive me, Prince Oberyn. I didn't realize it was you. You had no reason to suspect who I was, and the last time we saw one another was when we were little more than children," Oberyn said as he waved his hand to dismiss it. His eyes suddenly gained a dangerous edge as he seemed to realize something. "Why are you here? Oh wait, let me guess. Your lovely and oh so charming sister is to be Rhaegar's new queen." The scorn in the Dornish prince's voice made Jaime flinch, and normally he would not hesitate to rush to his sister's defense, but he could find the will to. Cersei had not been at her best when Oberyn and his sister had met her. "Yes, she is," he said simply. There was nothing else he could say. Oberyn hummed and took a step closer, and Jaime had to remind himself to stand his ground. He was a lion, and he would not cringe, and he would not flee. "You know," Oberyn began, "my sister was going to marry Rhaegar. She was going to be the queen of the Seven Kingdoms. And now she isn't. Now she's the wife of the Warden of the North's second son," Jaime said. "Funny how life works out, isn't it?" For a moment Oberyn's face was like stone before he let out a little chuckle. "Indeed," Oberyn said before he stepped past Jaime and began to make his way inside. "Prince Oberyn," Jaime called, and the prince stopped walking but didn't turn to face him. "Why are you here?" Oberyn chuckled again and just slightly tilted his back to look at Jaime. "Lannisters aren't the only ones who pay their debts." And with that, he was gone. Jaime suddenly felt like he was plunged into a vat of cold water. With one tiny action his family suddenly had an entire family of new enemies. It could never be simple. Underscore 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 underscore. Cersei could hardly contain the bubble of excitement that brewed in her stomach. It was really happening. She was really here. She was in King's Landing, and she was going to marry Rhaegar and be a princess, and soon she would be a queen as well. It wouldn't be long. Tales of the king's poor Heath had reached the Westerlands. It was said that he did not even eat anymore, and he barely slept or drank anymore. He was clinging to life by his fingernails by all accounts. She would be queen before too long. And, maybe all he would need was a little push. She could do that. The king was a monster. She would lose no sleep over it, and if her father and her future husband's plan worked. Lord Connington stopped in front of a door and he knocked on it. "My prince, Lady Cersei has arrived," he spoke through the door. "Please show her in, Jon." That gentle voice spoke, and Cersei couldn't help but smile. His voice sounded so beautiful. Lord Connington pushed the door open and he and Circe walked into the room, and her breath caught in her throat as she laid eyes on her prince. He was so beautiful, his silver hair was longer than hers and his eyes were the most striking purple she had ever seen in her entire life, far more pretty than Ashura Dane's. He was muscular but slim and his hands ended with long, delicate fingers. In that one moment Circe was more attracted to her prince than she had ever been to Jaime. She would gladly take Roriger into her bed whenever he asked it of her, and she would gladly swell with his children and birth them all, dragons with golden hair and violet eyes or silver hair and green. They would be so beautiful. Your beauty is not overstated, Lady Circe, Roriger said with a smile as he gently took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, and suddenly there was a new heat stirring in her loins. Could you leave us for a moment, Jon? The ginger man grunted and left the room, muttering under his breath as he went. I want you to know that I will do everything in my power to make you happy, Roriger said as he gently held Circe's hands. But please, I understand that I need you to do your duty. I need children. I understand, my love, Circe said as gazed adoringly up at her prince. I'll give you as many as you want. And she would do anything to keep him happy with her. Her love's eyes narrowed a little. Did your father, did he see you off? He asked. Circe blinked for a moment as she tried to understand before it suddenly hit her. She slid her left hand into her right dress sleeve and slid out a scroll of paper. Yes, he did, and he sends his regards, she said as she handed the paper over. Thank you, Lady Circe, that eases my mind no end, Roriger said as he walked back to his desk and sat down to read the scroll. I am sure you are tired from your journey on the King's Road. Do you know where your apartments, or would you like me to summon a servant so they can show you the way? Circe could not keep the disappointed pout off of her face, but she understood that her love had important work to do, so she refused the offer of a servant and left her future husband and king to his work. It wouldn't be long now. End of chapter 14. Wife of the Wolf, Husband of the Sun. Chapter 15. Elia smiled brightly down at Lauren, who was babbling happily up at her. The girl was growing like a weed and she seemed most suited for the cold of the north. She was happy and more active here than she had ever been in Dawn, and she had been very happy and active in Dawn. Given who Ashura had reviled who her father was, it did not come as a massive surprise. Through the child's newfound energy had continually tired her mother out, as was to be expected. Speaking of Ashura, she was sitting in the chair next to her bed and was watching her daughter and her friend with a deep fondness, but it was clear that she was exhausted from trying to keep up with her daughter. Ashura and Lauren had been keeping her company while she recovered from her collapse for the past 3 weeks, and she was glad of it. There was nothing worse than recovering and being left on her own to deal with it. Having Ashura and Lauren was a great help and stopped from climbing the walls out of sheer boredom. They had not been the only ones to keep her company, of course. Her husband had been spending a great deal of time with her. Some days they simply laid there spending time talking to one another, and others times they did more than talk, quite a great deal more than talk. Ned had been worried as he did not want to hurt her or hold back her recovery, but she had managed to convince him when she told him that she was feeling a great deal better and any complaints had died in his throat when mounted atop him and rode him like a stallion to completion. As time had passed, the love they shared had grown. While they had not said it again since that day she had woken, it was clear that she was not the only one who still felt that way. The way he smiled at her when he walked into her chambers, his sullen face brightening up. The way he held after they were done and kissed her forehead. The love they shared grew every day, and that realization made her more happy than she ever thought possible. Brandon and Lyanna had not made any appearances, but that did not surprise Elia much as far as Elia was aware, Lyanna had still been confined to her room, and Brandon did not seem the type to come and check on his brother's wife, and Elia was glad that he didn't bother to visit her. They didn't have much in common, and she wasn't sure if she would be able to stop herself from blurting out something that would make Brandon suspect about Lauren and Ashura. Caitlin had also come to visit her as well. Most of the time they had simply spoken about how things with Brandon were going. The poor girl clearly needed, and most of their talks ended with younger women crying and Elia trying to comfort her, but she did not mind at all. Lord Ricard had visited her a few times to make sure that she was well and to tell her that he had sent a letter to Doran to inform him of what had happened. When he told her that, Elia had felt a surge of dread. Not that she was worried about Doran's reaction, as he was a reasonable man who knew that something like this would probably happen at some point and would trust her new family to look after her. No, what worried her was Oberyn's reaction. Oberyn was a viper, and he acted before he thought his actions through properly. When he found out that she had collapsed, he was likely to ride day and night with an army of men at his back to make sure she was well and that the Starks were looking after her properly. And while she appreciated that Oberyn's actions would have been done out of love, she truly didn't want to be the cause of a diplomatic incident when a large force of Dornish troops tried to pass through the neck, and if he found that Lyanna was partly the cause of it, then he would more than likely try to kill her. Thankfully Doran had sent a letter back and it arrived a few days back. Oberyn hadn't even been in Dorne when the letter arrived, as he and his 3 daughters had gone to King's Landing and Doran had seen it wise not inform him of her collapse. Elia couldn't help but grin when she had seen that written. Though she did have to admit that she was more than a little confused as to why Oberyn was in King's Landing. Doran didn't say, and Elia got the sense that her brother would not tell her even if she asked, so she had simply sent a simple reply back. She could write to Uncle Luwin and ask him as to why Oberyn was there. Uncle Luwin always had a soft spot for her and he would likely tell her, and even if he didn't, then she could ask Ashura to write to Arthur to see if he knew, as she knew that her friend's brother couldn't deny her anything. More than anything else, she didn't want her brother causing trouble, and she didn't want him doing it in her name. She may have wanted to marry Rhaegar once, she may have loved him once, she may have wanted to be queen once. Now she had made her peace with the fact that ship had sailed